All right, this is everybody's 2-minute warning. Let everybody settle in and then we'll get started. Okay, it's a little after 20 after 2. I'd like to go ahead and get started with our next item on the agenda. But before I do, we have a new member sitting at the table with us. So I'm going to turn over to Tim Greiner with the South Atlantic Council. If you have any introductions or you want to just give us a little background as to what your role is at the council, that would be great before we get started.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, Tim Greiner. I'm the commercial representative from North Carolina on the South Atlantic Council. It's nice to be here. Thank you for allowing me to join. I see some familiar faces around the room over there. Been on the council. This is my 3rd term, so finally feel like I somewhat know what's going on, but maybe not always. But again, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for making the trip up here to be with us this week. Hope you enjoy Annapolis. So I'm going to call this meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council to order. This is our December 2022 meeting. As I've mentioned many times in the past, this is my hometown. So if anybody here has any questions about places to go to eat or anything to do around town, just let me know. I'm just going to say, there's been some, as you guys all know, I mentioned it in October. I'm probably not going to be around a whole lot in the evening due to some things that are happening with my family, but everything's fine. It's all good, but I'm probably going to be jumping back and forth from home, but I hope to stick around for the Wednesday social that I know everyone's excited about and planning for. But yeah, let me know if you need any information about the area. I'm happy to give you that information. So what I'd like to do at this point, I know we're running a little behind. I'm going to turn over to Jessica. We have an habitat activities update on the agenda. And Jessica, I know we have a number of presenters from the regional office's Habitat and Ecosystem Service Division. I know they're online, but maybe I'll kick it to you. I don't know who's going to go first, second, third. I'm sure you have a plan. So I'm going to jump over to you, Jessica, for any introductions. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have a plan. So we have Karen Green, Doug Crystal, Pete Burns, and Kevin Madley from Habitat and Ecosystem Services Division online. We usually invite them to speak with you in June and December. June was really busy, so we got a written update from them in June, but they're here to talk with you today. So I'm going to be running the slide deck for them. And if I can hand this off to Karen Green first.
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Karen Green with the Habitat and Ecosystem Services Division, and I'm the Mid-Atlantic Branch Chief. And we're very happy to be here today to give you our semi-annual update on the habitat activities in the region. Can I have the next slide, please? So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about aquaculture, infrastructure, and offshore wind, and we'll kick it off with Kevin Madley with the aquaculture update, and then I'll do infrastructure, and Doug will talk a little bit about the offshore wind. So with that, I will pass it along to Kevin.
Great, thanks, Karen. And I will jump right into the update to try to be efficient and have time at the end for questions. So the slide you're seeing now is an overview of existing projects proposed or in operation in the EEZ within the United States. As you'll see, there's not many. So two of these, actually three of these, are permanently permitted. The rest of them have applied for permits. The one exception is the Mana Fish Farms New York project, which had submitted applications to the federal agencies, or at least to the Army Corps in the state of New York back in around 2019. Those applications have been pulled administratively, looking for updated information. But because we've heard from Mana Fish Farms recently, the federal agencies that they're proposing to do baseline environmental surveys and possibly submit applications, as early as 2023, we thought we'd include them in this list. So the three permitted projects currently are Ocean Rainforest out off of Santa Barbara, California, a kelp farm. And then here in the Northern Atlantic, Salem State University has had a permitted pilot scale project for blue mussels off of Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And then more recently, a project led by Rutgers with many partners was permitted to conduct Surfclam pilot project off of New Jersey. Next slide, please. So I'll give you an overview of a few of the projects in our region. I'm not going to go through all of those around the country, but just the ones closer to home here for the purposes of this meeting. Mana Fish Farms is proposing to construct a commercially viable marine finfish facility about 9 miles off of Shinnecock Inlet, New York. The facility would occupy approximately 400-acre site, and upon full build out would be 12 to 18 net pens capable of producing, according to Mana Fish Farms, around 9 million pounds of fish. They recently resubmitted an overview of the project, which included their top 3 species of interest to culture. In order of priority, it was striped bass, black sea bass, and steelhead trout. And yes, they have been made aware, or they are aware, that there are prohibitions against fishing for and possessing striped bass in the EEZ. Next slide, please. So the project I mentioned previously, headed up by Rutgers, but with partners Surfside, Sea-Watch, and Atlantic Cape Fisheries, was funded by Sea Grant. It was permitted through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Nationwide Permit 48, and it's proposing to pilot scale project culture of surf clams about 3 miles off of Atlantic City, New Jersey. The Rutgers Aquaculture Innovation Center has been producing surf clams and and testing or trying to produce strains with temperature and pH tolerance attributes, which they would like to test. And I know at least, one of the objectives of the project is to look at growth and viability or survivability rates of clams in this location. And they have talked about the interest in this as a potential informed feasibility of stock enhancement in the future. The idea is to put 10 cages out for this pilot project at this location that would rest on the seafloor and be marked with single line and buoy to the surface with associated weak links. Next slide, please. The last project I'll go into a little bit of detail about is actually up in New England, but we wanted to update you and share how they're interacting, or the project is causing some interactions with the council, the New England Council. So this project proposes up to start out with 2 net pens and then phase in up to 40 net pens off of about 9 miles off of Newburyport, Massachusetts. The target species are steelhead trout, Atlantic salmon, and then they do propose to use lumpfish as a external parasite cleaner fish in the operation. Next slide, please. One of the reasons this project is important to mention, even though it's up in New England, is that they do have, one of their target species for culture is a species which is managed by the New England Fisheries Management Council through an existing fisheries management plan. So that has caused, over the course of 2022, discussions with the council, and they are proposing they have set up a plan development team and are proposing framework adjustment within that Atlantic salmon FMP to consider, appropriate management measures on how to allow for possession of Atlantic salmon for aquaculture projects in their region. Next slide, please. Now, moving away from, proposed projects updates, I'm going to provide more updates from our agency. One of these relates directly to GARFO produced information. As you'll see on the slide, there are 2 new documents that exist on our web pages, and the web pages are listed there on the slide. These documents are information or guidance for information needs from action agencies being the permitting authorities. We've copied this process from recent efforts for offshore wind, in which we produced guidance documents for BOEM, as in, what would be needed when they submit a request for consultation or request for project proposals or project reviews to GARFO, the types of information we would expect to see along with those requests. So like I say, we followed suit what's happened with offshore wind. We created these documents in line in similar fashion, so that for future offshore aquaculture projects, the Army Corps, the EPA, the different federal permitting agencies will have this guidance to refer to on what information should be included in those requests to NOAA Fisheries. That being said, these documents can be used as references and good information as far as what we as an agency are looking for and the types of things we would be evaluating in consultations and project reviews. So they can be useful for council staff, for stakeholders, and definitely for proponents is the type of information that would be requested. Next slide, please. I also wanted to mention that over the course of 2021 and 2022, NOAA Fisheries Office of Aquaculture updated many outreach documents and created some new outreach documents which exist on this website that's listed on the slide within the NOAA Aquaculture Library. These are like 2-pagers, front and back, initial resources for, if council staff gets questioned or other stakeholders have questions about things like antibiotic use in finfish culture or aquaculture feeds information. These are kind of initial resources to help have that exchange of information, and largely because they're so brief, they point people to additional resources and experts within the agency to reach out with further questions. But I wanted to be sure everyone was aware of these resources. And next slide, please. And this is the last slide for aquaculture. Just wanted to make sure everyone had seen that there was a recent release of the NOAA Aquaculture Strategic Plan for 2023 through 2028. It has 4 main goals, which you see listed there on the slide, many objectives nested under those goals. But I largely wanted to point out the fact that this is the first of its kind, in that it was the first time NOAA across its line offices and the breadth of the agency contributed to and put out a joint strategic plan for aquaculture. Previously, you may have seen aquaculture strategic plans that were from NOAA Fisheries or parts of National Ocean Service. But this was the first time it was across all of NOAA. So it's in that way, it's significant. And I wanted to be sure you all were aware of it and had a chance to review what the agency is seeing as their focus areas for the next 5 years related to aquaculture. And that is it for me on the aquaculture updates.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, I'm up, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the infrastructure activities going on in our region. So next slide, please. The first thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers coastal storm risk management studies that are happening in the Mid-Atlantic. And I've had these in some of our previous updates before, so some of them are familiar to you all, I hope. There are 3 in our region of note. I've previously talked about the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study. This past October, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers released the draft integrated feasibility report and Tier 1 environmental impact statement for public comment on this project. It's that little graphic you see on the bottom left is the region for this project. They are accepting comments through March 7th. They just extended the comment period. It was originally January 6th. We are working on reviewing the document and drafting our comments. It's 1,000+ pages long. The tentatively selected plan in this document includes a variety of measures to reduce flood risks from coastal storms, including storm surge barriers and complementary shore-based, measures at Jamaica Bay, Arthur Kill, the Kilvan Call, the Gowanus Canal, Newtown Creek, Flushing Creek, Sheepshead Bay, Garrettson Creek, the Hackensack River, and Old Howard Beach East and Old Howard Beach West. So there's a number of locations where they're planning storm surge barriers and levees and flood walls, elevated promenades, buried seawalls and dunes, revetments, berms, bulkheads. It's a pretty comprehensive plan. As with all of the studies, the coastal storm risk management studies, it also includes non-structural measures such as structural elevations and flood proofing as part of the plan. The other project is the New Jersey Back Bay study, which I've mentioned before. That study has been underway since 2018. The draft feasibility study and EIS was released in August of 2021. And GARFO, HCSD, and many others provided extensive comments on that tentatively selected plan, which includes storm surge barriers across the Manasquan Inlet, Barnegat Inlet, and the Great Egg Harbor Inlet, as well as cross bay barriers at Absecon Boulevard and in southern Ocean City, with the elevation and flood proofing of 18,000 structures. In response to the many comments that the Corps got, they are developing a supplemental environmental impact statement, and they are working to refine some aspects of the plan, which includes now an additional storm surge barrier at the entrance to Gardner's Basin. The supplemental EIS is expected to be released in June 2023. The third study is a new one. It's the Virginia Beach study, and this study began in July of this year and is expected to take at least 3 years to complete. The city of Virginia Beach is the project sponsor. And if you go to the link that's on this slide, there's a 9.5-minute narrated storyboard posted by the Norfolk Army Corps of Engineers on YouTube that outlines the project and provides information on the process. They're in scoping right now, so they're accepting scoping comments to help develop the draft EIS and integrated feasibility study. Next slide. The other major projects that are going on in our region are port developments, and these developments are mostly associated with offshore wind. So we have on the bottom left of the slide, at least from my view, it's the New Jersey Wind Port, and that is located on the Delaware River adjacent to the Salem Hope Creek Nuclear Power Station. The facility is being developed by the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, and it's a marshaling port that will serve offshore wind projects in New Jersey and up and down the East Coast. Phase 1 of the project is currently permitted under construction, and that includes a 30-acre marshaling area for component assembly and staging. The project also included about 80 acres of dredging for berthing to access the Delaware River Channel, and a heavy lift wharf with dedicated delivery and installation berth that can accommodate jackup vessels. Completion of construction is anticipated in 2024. There's a second phase of the project that is now currently in the pre-application stage with the federal and state agencies, and that's going to include an additional laydown areas, manufacturing, and another 4 berths. We attended an interagency meeting for that part of the project earlier today, and it includes about another 80 to 100 acres of dredging. And when completed, this particular project will be able to accommodate 3, 4, or more projects ongoing at the same time, wind projects. It is not connected to any particular offshore wind project. It's more of a, we're building it and we're hoping that projects off the coast will use the facility, or the applicants are hoping. The other project is the Arthur Kill Marine Terminal. This one is also not yet permitted. It's in the pre-application stage, and it's a proposed port located on the south side of Staten Island, just south of the Outer Bridge crossing. There have been a number of interagency meetings with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the state of New York, U.S. EPA, and NOAA Fisheries. This project includes about a 1,300 linear foot pile supported wharf and a 28.5 operations area for wind turbine components. This one will also involve dredging and about 10 acres of fill within the Arthur Kill. One of the things that we're talking about now with the agencies is mitigation for that fill, as well as avoidance minimization and alternatives. The last one is the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, and unlike the other two, this port is directly connected to a specific offshore wind project. In this case, the Equinor, BP's Empire, and Beacon Wind projects. The South Brooklyn Marine Terminal facility will be an operations and maintenance hub and staging area for these projects. The proposed work at this site includes the installation of sheet pile and riprap, floating and pile supporting platforms, and dredging. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers currently has a public notice out for comment on this project, and as well as the overall Empire Wind project. And comments are due on that by January 6th. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Crystal for the offshore wind update.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doug Crystal, Fishery Policy Analyst on the wind team, and I'll be taking you through a little bit of updates on our offshore wind projects within the Habitat and Ecosystem Services Division. Next slide, please. Our first element I wanted to discuss is the essential fish habitat consultations. We currently have 8 projects under review, but we have not yet initiated consultation for these projects. In many instances, we are reviewing the materials presented and or seeking information, additional information that would enable us to initiate those consultations. In some instances, we're also working with BOEM to adjust the timelines associated with these consultations to make sure that we have the right information to initiate those consultations. So there's a lot of work associated with those. And some of the information, for example, that we're seeking is information on boulder relocation, which is a part of the construction operations plans elements for the cable laying and preparatory work that may affect not only essential fish habitat, but also fishing operations, depending on where those boulders are relocated to facilitate the installation of cables. Next slide, please. Obviously, you're very well aware of the Central Atlantic Bight call areas that BOEM proposed earlier this year. There is an effort underway with NCOS to help model the various data sources that are available to help BOEM make an informed decision on where is the most suitable areas for offshore wind development in this region. We have provided technical data and advice on data layers relevant to marine resources, including prioritizing those data sets as appropriate, such as priority habitat areas, areas of overlapping fishing activities, etc. Some of the concerns that we've raised during our June 24th, 2022 comments include making sure they're consider the coral protection areas that the Mid-Atlantic Council has developed earlier, recognizing sensitive habitat overlaps with these areas, fishing operations, protected species interactions, and to consider how cables are going to be transmitted from the offshore areas. And I'll leave it to BOEM to provide additional information on that. Next slide, please. We currently have a number of projects under review. Empire Wind is, as Karen just mentioned, the DEIS comments are under consideration with comments due to BOEM by January 17th, 2023. There's a number of public hearings, one of which was last week, and then there's two upcoming on December 13th at 5 and December 15th at 1 p.m. CVOW, we expect to have their DEIS publish on December 16th, as well as Sunrise Wind. And we have a New England Wind is another upcoming project we expect by the end of this year. And I'll defer to BOEM, who will present potentially more information on that in the next presentation. Next slide, please. As Karen indicated, there are several projects under review for the Army Corps of Engineers public notices. They're all involving Empire Wind. The Empire Wind 1 and 2 cable landfalls, Cable 1 in Brooklyn and Cable 2 in Long Beach, as well as the Empire Wind South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Comments on that, as Karen noted, are due January 6, 2023. We will be providing technical advice to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in response to these public notices. Next slide, please. I wanted to give a little bit of update on what we're doing relative to socioeconomic impact reports. As many of you may know, we have a website that has socioeconomic impact reports based on historic fishing operations for each lease area and approved project area. We've updated these reports to include additional years of data, including 2020 and 2021. We also identified a few additional tables that lay out data by state and port. We also provide vessel and trip counts by small and large entities. Some of those you're familiar with the fishery management plan actions. And we also provide a yearly regional relative percent totals for landings and revenues of each species within each project area. Those updated reports are available on our website that went live December 7th. And if you have any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer that. There's also a data download page where you can download all of these data by project into a spreadsheet, and you can manipulate it to look into any element that you need for your purposes. Next slide, please. We are currently exploring alternative ways of identifying some data gaps in fisheries operations and wind overlap. And one of those elements is private angling information. We explored using data associated with the Fish Rules app as well as the Fish Brain app. Both of these applications are either mobile devices, you can look into the fisheries regulations, species identification in the terms of fish rules, whereas FishBrain is more of a social media platform where you can identify and post pictures of the catch and your location. And those apps provide geolocation information that we can mine for concentrations of fishing effort as a proxy to represent angler activity. And so we're trying to explore these. We are hoping that the data associated with those can help inform exploration of angler city origin and travel costs associated with private angling and how they overlap with fishery management areas as well as offshore wind areas. This could be used to assess port communities and impacts to angling, individual angling for various species. Next slide, please. And then finally, I wanted to touch on a couple other issues that we're exploring, such as environmental justice and social vulnerability. We intend to look into exploring the NIMS community social vulnerability indicators and integrating those into our existing reports for each project. This will provide an additional layer of information to inform the impacts of each project on the various communities and how they interrelate with offshore wind developmental impacts. We are also exploring additional information that would help us evaluate shoreside impacts and compensation needs, including estimates to improve or efforts to improve the estimates and provide guidance for cumulative impact evaluations. And then finally, based on some information we've heard in various fora, we are trying to evaluate the permit valuation and potential changes due to management and wind project impacts. So there's another number of initiatives we're exploring. Some of these may result in peer-reviewed literature, while as others may just enhance existing analysis. That is all I have for today, and happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
So I just want to thank Kevin, Doug for their presentations. A lot of really good information. What I'd like to do, and I should have mentioned this before we started, the past over the last year, but I think council, with the exception of just a couple people, are raising your hand in the line. Those of you who are on the council and are online, please go ahead. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll call on you. Jump back and forth between top of them but let's see if that works for everyone. Then we'll go to the public if the public has any comments or questions. But instead of just taking questions at this time, let's do questions and comments. I have a question for Doug. Vessel bond. And areas already leased, modeling what was there. Knowledge is more accurate than exercise, and also helpful to both NOAA and BOEM to show the fishing industry and where they fish with that type of spatial planning. Doug, do you have something, or maybe Jessica?
So I think there's an issue with the audio. In the chat, folks had said they were having some problems hearing. Can they hear now? Okay, so we might need to ask that question again, since the audio went out. I'm really, really sorry about that.
Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, I was wondering about the NCCOS Marine Spatial Planning deconflicting model that was used in the Gulf and also in the Central Atlantic for the, particularly to the pelagic longline industry. That where our VMS was used to show where we fish at. And to me, that's the most crucial, it's the important thing. A proven tool is where the vessel at, and you can see track lines and where the activity is. And I think it's a heck of a exercise to show where the vessels and the fisheries, particularly the VMS that's used. I don't know exactly all the fisheries that have VMS, but the ones, and I would also go back to areas already leased and do an overlay of that. If it was not done to show, that shows your fishing effort and where it actually happens at. And it's my belief, my experience, that would be better than a BTR, more accurate. Thank you.
Doug, were you able to hear that? Do you have a
Yes,
response?
I was, Mike, and thank you, Dewey, for your comment. During the NCOS modeling effort for the Central Atlantic, I can't speak for the Gulf of Mexico, but pelagic longline VMS data, along with scallop, highly monkfish, squid, mackerel, butterfish, surf clam, herring, and other fisheries were used. So the Greater Atlantic regions VMS data, as well as the pelagic longline fleet from the Highly Migratory Species Division, were used in that modeling effort. You can also check out the VMS data layers on either the Marco or the Northeast Ocean data portal. They will have the heat maps, so to speak, of the VMS data overlaid with these wind energy areas. So if you look on those data portals, you can combine layers for various fisheries or all fisheries combined and have a relatively good sense on where that overlap occurs. We did offer the VTR data for the Central Atlantic Bight modeling effort, and it's ultimately BOEM's decision whether and how to use those data, but they are available for that modeling effort because, as most of you know, not all fisheries are covered by VMS, whereas at least for the Greater Atlantic region, the vessel trip report data are more comprehensive, not totally comprehensive, but more comprehensive, particularly for the non-VMS fleets such as, the fluke, scup, and black sea bass, and more of the shoreside fleets. So those data are available on the portals, and they were offered for the NCOS modeling effort for Central Atlantic.
Dr. Michelle Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is for Doug as well. Thanks for the presentation, Doug. Two questions. The first is with respect to the ongoing efforts that you mentioned about, integrating the community social vulnerability indicators into the offshore wind reports, as well as like the additional information to help inform the shoreside impacts and compensation methods and the permit valuation. I'm wondering if you have a sense of the timeline for when those things might be completed or available. And then my second question was with respect to the private angler info and, exploring fish rules. And I'm wondering if y'all have thought about potential other applications for that as maybe supplemental information for MREP estimates. Thank you.
Yes, good questions. Timeline for some of the ongoing work is probably in the spring. Some of those materials will be available for draft manuscripts. For example, the Fish Rules Fish app is a draft manuscript underway by Garrett DePiper and a couple other researchers, and that might be available for April time period. There's ongoing work integrating the community development or community vulnerability indicators. We don't have a clear timeline of when that might be completed. That has been an ongoing initiative, and so we haven't made that much progress given the workload that we're conducting for reviewing projects as well as the socioeconomic compensation guidelines. So I think that's a little bit further delayed. We have been in discussion with various entities, including some of the data portals, to update the fishing community profile data. So it's ongoing. I can certainly provide an update, but I don't have a definitive timeline. Relative to other recreational data sources, we have consulted with our Southeast Regional Office who are pursuing other initiatives such as query consistency and frequency to evaluate fishery impact or effort relative increases and decreases and other relatively unique methods. But we're open to consider other opportunities and data sources that would provide a more spatially explicit evaluation of private angling data. So we are trying to keep our options open, but these seemed some promising information that we explored on based on a few consultations with developers. But if you have any ideas, please send them my way and I'd happily pursue those other thoughts.
All right, thank you, Doug. Is there anyone else at the table that has any comments or questions for the presenters? Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll say again, good afternoon, everybody, and happy holidays. Thank you all for your collective report. I think this is for Doug. And Doug, on your slide 20, you're on your socioeconomic reports. This is just a snapshot of the impacted species inside the Sunrise Wind area. Is that correct?
Yes, these are just examples from the reports, and I will post the link to our report page in the chat box so everybody can see it. But there's a report for each current lease area and or approved project area.
Thanks. So I didn't know where Sunrise Wind was. I couldn't figure out the location in my head. I went and looked it up. It looks like it's off the tip of Montauk in the coast of Connecticut, but I believe it's more associated with New York than it is with Connecticut. So it might be helpful to have a little chart in there showing where the area is so we have a better understanding in it. And before I recognized where it was, I was kind of wondering why surf clams weren't on that list, because they are also an impacted species, but I'm guessing the VTR data that you're deriving these impacts from doesn't show any heat signatures from the surf clam fishery in those areas. And that's just a guess of mine, but I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Anyone else at the table before I turn things over to the public? Okay, seeing no hands at this time, I'm going to go ahead to one of our online folks, Mike Wayne, and then Bonnie, I saw your hand. We'll go to you next. Go ahead, Mike. Is that an audio? I saw Mike put his hand down. Is that an audio issue? Can you tell, Stephen? Okay, go ahead, Bonnie. Come on up to the mic. Thanks.
Hi, Bonnie Brady, Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. I have about 4 different questions for the person that was speaking regarding aquaculture. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Can you explain what you meant regarding the discussion with Mana Fish Farm and that their permit application was pulled administratively? Why was the application pulled?
I can tell you what I know, but that's it was an Army Corps decision, so I only know second or third hand that it had to do with, they had a number of questions for amount of fish farms to respond to get to a point where it's deemed a complete application. And they weren't going to meet that deadline. They weren't going to have all that information in the time the Army Corps needed it, but also the Army Corps had some other administrative changes internally. And so they suggested they were going to end that application again through some administrative procedure, and informed monofish farms that when they do get the additional information they had asked for, they would just need to submit it with a new application.
Okay, so that brings me to the second question. So is there any comment period within National Marine Fisheries Service, or is the only comment period that's going to be available and regarding the entire project with the Army Corps, since they're considered structures, at least the net pens are?
Yeah, so there will be, you're correct, there will be a public comment period open through the Army Corps permit process. But additionally, a fish fin net pen project for fish culture will need an EPA permit. So there will also be public comment periods through that permit process. Those are two separate processes. And then additionally, there will be a NEPA process. In this case, we believe it will be NOAA Fisheries that would probably be the lead for that NEPA process. And then, so therefore we would host public comment periods also.
Okay, and next, can you tell us when we as the public can see those applications in their entirety? Years ago, Amana submitted an application when they were planning to do this project in state waters, and what they submitted as an application was greatly different from what they told the public, including the commercial fish industry, regarding what their project was going to be, including species and overall poundage. So when exactly will we have a chance to see on the various sites? Is there going to be one overall site? How will the commercial fishing industry and members of the public be notified?
So the permit applications would go from monofish farms to those two agencies, Army Corps and EPA, and then they follow their procedures for when to post or make public the applications and their public notification processes. So I can't speak exactly. Well, that and the fact that we don't know when or really if monofish farms will submit applications. We just know that they've been reaching out to the federal agencies, trying to understand the process, and they've indicated they're interested in performing baseline environmental surveys for the proposed sites in 2023. So I suspect that's going to be followed at some point with future applications.
Do they have to notify you, though, prior to or when they are submitting to the Army Corps and to EPA, so that some notification could be made to the council and or through the council webpage? So that way we could get information on that. I don't know, I don't believe, because it's not in state waters, so New York State Department of State, I don't believe would be involved.
Yeah, good point. So there's nothing regulatory where they have to notify us if they submit an application to those other agencies. But because we're involved in the discussions and the other agencies know that we have a role, possibly under Executive Order 13921 to lead the NEPA process, I don't believe they would submit those applications without us knowing. But there is no regulatory reason they have to do that. So I can't commit to saying that we would know and post something, but the Army Corps and EPA would be the recipients of those applications.
So would there be something that one of the councils would have to request of NIMS in order to possibly, or GARFO, to be able to actively notify those that might be affected by this project, so we have a heads up, or we just have to individually go through the EPA and the Army Corps websites?
Yeah, that's good. These are good questions. Like I said, I don't see a situation in which we won't know that they're submitting applications, because they've been keeping the three federal agencies in the loop. So I think we would know, and then our role in communicating to the council is to make sure the council is aware of any activity that's moving, proposing to put structures out in the water. So I don't think there would be a lag. I just am being a little hesitant to commit because we don't have a regulatory hook
Right.
for Vermont fish farms to submit those applications to us. So I can't commit to you that we would have them the same time EPA and Forward. I just don't see a situation when that would be likely.
If there is an ability, it'd be greatly appreciated because like I said, in the past, when they had our former application in, they told the public that they were only going to do one fish species. And then in the application, they said they were going to do 10 or 12. And it was a far larger project, and putting 9.1 million pounds of fish into the New York market would be a real concern for the commercial industry. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could follow up, Bonnie, on your other point about New York being notified, there will be a need for New York, even though these projects are in the EZ, the states have a role to review and comment through the Coastal Zone Management Act. And there is an actual application process which can happen or through the Army Corps notifying the state. They will have a chance to be notified and comment.
All right, Kevin, thank you very much for those answers to those questions. I'm going to go back to Mike Wayne, who has his hand back up. I think he was disconnected, but go ahead. Go ahead, Mike. And then after Mike, I'm going to come back to the council for any last questions, comments before we move on. Go ahead, Mike.
Mr. Chairman, it's Mike Wayne. I can hear you pretty well. Can you hear me?
You're a little faint, but I think we can make it out.
Okay, I'll try and speak up. So I came in a little late. I came in right as the presenter was talking about fish brain and fish rules. And so if you could you repeat the application that you plan to use that information? So that's my first question. And then my second question is, have you done any outreach with the recreational fishing industry regarding the collection and announcement, outreach, engagement, anything with the industry about your use of that information? So I'll stop there and let you talk.
All right, thanks, Mike. It was a little hard to understand, but let me turn to the panel and see if folks could hear a little better than maybe I could. Is there anyone that wants to answer those questions?
Hi, Mike. I can answer that question, and good to hear you, Mike. We are exploring how to use those in just a private analysis that we're conducting for NIMS. So we consulted with FishBrain and Fish Rules app developers on what their data contained and whether it might produce useful information that could address some of these questions, data gaps that we've had relative to private angling information. All the information is anonymous. We have masked it very similar to how we have masked the information on the commercial and party charter VTR data. So it will be, the confidentiality will be protected to the extent that we can. And so this is more of a manuscript exploration effort to try to address this gap. So we don't have an application per se that we're going to post it on. It's really just a NIMS technical paper that we're exploring. Relative to outreach, to the extent possible, our staff are reaching out to various private angling and charter party entities whenever we can to explore what the ideas they have, what data sources might be relevant to explore these data gaps and analytical needs. Again, we try as much as we can given the time we have.
All right, I appreciate that, Doug. All right, I'm going to bring it back to the council. Does anyone else on the council have any questions or comments they'd like to make at this time? Okay, seeing none. I want to thank Kevin, Doug, and Karen for presenting to us today. Thank you all very much. It was a lot of really good information, and we'll definitely keep in touch as things develop over time. I'd like to move on to our next item on the agenda. And then what we'll do is we're going to take this next item, and then we'll take a quick break before we deal with surf clams and ocean quahog. So we're making up a little bit of time here. We're a little bit over time, but our next presenter, I believe, is Karen. Are you going to go? You're going first? Okay. So we have Karen Baker, who's the Chief of BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. And we also have Joe Sabino, who's going to be providing us a presentation as well. I'm going to start with Karen, and I also welcome to the table Brian Hooker from BOEM as well, who we all know. We've seen him a lot over the years. And so welcome here. Welcome both of you. And I'm going to turn things over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the entire council for having us here today. As mentioned, my name is Karen Baker, and as of July, I am the Chief of Office of Renewable Energy Programs at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This is a new position. I am not a new senior executive, but it's a new senior executive position that BOEM has created, given the importance of maintaining engagements and addressing and having leadership over the entire portfolio of offshore wind. And so I've been enjoying this position, getting a chance to get information and learn a little bit about what we're doing. I'm not new to this region. I came here before, before I came to BOEM, I was the Regional Programs Director for the North Atlantic Division. So got to engage a lot with Karen Green. It was nice to hear her voice on the call just now, and many of the coastal resilience projects that were spoken about with the Army Corps of Engineers was one or more of our districts that I oversaw working. So glad to be here. This presentation is intended to be an overview. It's probably going to be a review for many of you of many of the projects that we have ongoing in our portfolio, and specifically geared towards the projects within the Mid-Atlantic region. It's probably going to be a little bit of review for many of you who are familiar with what BOEM does. It's definitely going to be a review, given that Doug gave a great rundown of many of these in his presentation just now. But I'm hoping that it's going to be the start, more than just new information, but the start of a dialogue. As I've come on board and have gotten familiar with BOEM's mission and what we do here, and how important it is to have stakeholder engagement throughout all of our work. And it's something that I'm committed to and have a lifelong commitment to in the work that I have done. It's very important that we seek your input, not only seek your input, but find ways to consider and engage and incorporate your input. And as we have these conversations, I'm hoping that this is just the first of a dialogue that we're going to have with you. And I'm hoping that, represented by my presence here, I see the importance of this council as well as all its members and having your input into our processes. There's an extensive amount of work underway. And so not only looking for feedback on current project initiatives, but how we can best engage and continue dialogue and have the input. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and kind of launch into some of our presentation and a little bit of information about what we're doing. But again, we're going to take comments. I've got Brian here to serve as a lifeline, our lead biologist, and any details and anything and regarding questions that you have. He can go much deeper than I can on many of these things, but I'm really glad to have him here with us as well. And I know that he's somebody that's familiar to you all. And I'll go ahead and ask for the next slide. So just as part of an overview, of course, BOEM's mission and authority comes from the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, which gives us governance over the responsibility of ensuring that we are managing both environmentally and economically responsible the Outer Continental Shelf. And with the Energy Policy Act of 2005, renewable energy, specifically wind energy, became much more frequently part of our portfolio. Go to the next slide. What we do, we can't do without the states, and we engage directly with the states through Governor's Task Force, and the state leadership has expressed its renewable energy goals, and we work very closely with them in what we develop. We'll go to the next slide. And we are also guided by our administration goals. And so this administration has issued Executive Order 14,008 that called for the Interior Department to identify steps to increase responsible renewable energy development on public lands and waters. And it included a first ever national offshore wind goal, we call 30 by 30, 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And as we talk about the portfolio, we are actively engaged in reviewing numerous leases and plans that are involved in helping us to achieve that goal. But of course, we have the responsibility at BOEM ensuring that we are doing that in a way that takes into account all ocean users, including fisheries and including impacted communities, and to do it in an environmentally responsible way. So we can go to the next slide. This is just a little bit about our process. It's probably familiar to many of you. I acknowledge that. However, it's important for us to come talk through this a little bit because we have a number of things that are working in various stages. And so always important, especially when we start to engage and especially share this with the public, to let them know what we are doing and where we are in each phase of our projects. So we start with planning analysis. We look at large areas and identifying for leasing. Usually that gets whittled down a bit as we learn more about them. So we're in the planning analysis phase, and then we issue notice, and again, working with NCOS and others, and we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of Central Atlantic. Use the best science, taking into account stakeholder engagement to identify areas, and then to identify what we call wind energy areas. Once we feel that we're satisfied with that and we have done the public notices and we've gone through our process in that regard, we start to look into leasing. We have an auction. Many of you probably were following. We did have an auction last week with California, 5 wind energy areas that were auctioned in off the central coast and the northern coast of California, and then move into what we call site assessment. So the leases granted the lessees the right to do surveys, conduct surveys and other studies in that area. Then they submit their site assessment plan, which we review, and we have a role in all the way through. And then they submit what we call a construction and operation plan, COP, which we then move through once we deem it's complete. And that's a significant thing, and something we can talk about if we need to talk about that phase. And then we move into the NEPA process, and we have the lead agency, but we work very closely with NOAA, NIMS, with Fish and Wildlife Service, with EPA, and the Corps of Engineers and others to review that, to go through the environmental impact statement, and then once satisfied there, we will approve that COP and move into permitting installation. So that process can take about 5 years. There is not a specific timeline we associated with, of course, things like Battery 1 and other regulations that are on the books right now do sometimes accelerate that a bit. We're also looking for how we do it in the most efficient and streamlined manner, but we have to do it in a way that incorporates the input from all engaged stakeholders. And so that's something that we, with the complexities that we have and many things, that the challenges I think we've already talked about just here in the presentations earlier today, we have to take all of those into consideration. Those affect the timeline as well. Go to the next slide. This is just a little bit about the portfolio and where we are. I'm going to talk about some specifics to this region, but we currently have about 27 active commercial leases that are under some sort of review. We have 2 that have actually been permitted that we'll talk about, South Fork and Vineyard Wind. We have several other that are in the COP review process and under review. 10 that are in some sort of process, but we are starting to move towards various stages of draft EISs in all of them. Including several that have been announced today that are of interest to you all, I believe. Kind of moving from this, and you can see as we're looking at the Atlantic side, most of this is in the Atlantic right now. That is where most of the activity is happening. We have, again, had auctions for California. We're exploring wind energy areas in the Gulf of Mexico as well. and have several other call areas that we are looking at right now. And the Inflation Reduction Act authorizes us to start to explore the territories as well. So we're looking at Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and some others. And we're just in the infancy of just starting to look at that and plan and research for that. Next slide. So moving from those that are in to installation, it was kind of starting out. The rest of the presentation goes into a number of different projects that we have underway, and we'll kind of start with those that are under installation. So South Fork, many of you are aware of, is off the coast of Long Island, New York. And next milestone is facility design report. We're actually reviewing several of those at this point in time in the process. Next slide. Vineyard Wind is another one that has again been has had the go ahead to start installation, and we continue to review and monitor and work with NOAA, NIMS, and the Corps of Engineers and others in terms of looking at their milestones and their next stages of the reports. So that one is underway at this point in time, just getting started. Next slide. And these are the series of leases that are in the pipeline, so to speak, that are underway under some sort of construction, some review of their construction operation plan, so their COP plan. Some of them further along than others in the process. I could go to the next slide. It was mentioned earlier today, Empire Wind, and we are right now in the public comment period for Empire Wind. It is off of Long Island, New York, with the Marine Terminal substation as a connected project in Brooklyn. So that was mentioned earlier today, but just repeat, we are currently seeking public comments. We have public meetings. We had one held last week, and there are two actually this week. These are all virtual, so anyone is able to join online. We have one tomorrow and one on the 15th later on this week. So not the only time for public comment period, but those are the most attended, and those are the public meetings that we are holding. We're holding them in conjunction with Corps of Engineers, as well as the developer that is working on the substation and the Sunset Park area there of Brooklyn. The next one, Ocean Wind. This is also one. This is one where we're moving to our final environmental impact statement. Still working through the comments and working through the review on that. Next one. The newest draft environmental impact statement project. This one is just as reported in the previous presentation, has going forward for public comment on Friday. It will be published in the Federal Register on Friday. BOEM just announced this today, so you can go to our website for more information. But that will be a public comment period that will be open until February 14th. So largest wind installation in the U.S. And will be off the coast of Virginia Beach. And the other one that was announced today, I don't think we have a slide on. It's a little further north, but Sunrise, which I heard was mentioned earlier today too, also will be published on December 16th, and public comment will go until February 14th. Our way forward, as again looking at other wind leasing areas, and so New York Bight, Carolina Long Bay, and North Carolina are all, Northern California are all lease sales that we've had this year. We are looking at Gulf of Mexico, looking at the wind energy area of Central Atlantic, Oregon, and then Gulf of Maine going forward. Click on the next slide. Okay, we do have a slide on Central Atlantic. I'm glad. I wanted to make sure we inserted that. That's great. So this one is currently in planning phase. I've heard a lot of discussion about it already in today's meeting. We are seeking public comment at this point in time. The public comment period ends, the 30-day comment period ends this week on December 16th. We have conducted 2 public meetings so far. We have several more this week. We're working on that are actually geared towards certain stakeholder groups. We're talking to the Coast Guard later this week about concerns that they have about navigation in call area A. We are also talking to the task forces of each of the states later this week, and we have had one particular featured one particular public comment period featuring fisheries concerns and management, fisheries management, and we have also had one with environmental NGOs. So this one is, as mentioned, this is one that we are looking for comments. We've heard about concerns. We want to acknowledge those. We were pretty transparent in our announcement of this, and we have been in all of our presentations, that we recognize that many of these call areas, we know call area A has some concerns regarding navigation. There are some specific fishing concerns, and we have heard from NASA and others about other sites and other locations that may have some challenges here. Recognizing that, of course, we are taking all that into consideration and welcome the comments. We're going to be considering everything that we can find. This was something that was developed, as mentioned, with NCOS modeling. We're really proud of that partnership that we have with NOAA. But we recognize that there's still some areas that, as we look at the models, there might be some more information that others may have that we might need to take into consideration. And I don't know, Brian, if you want to speak, do you want to speak anything more about that specifically?
No, I mean, primarily, thanks, Karen. Yeah, I think even as Mr. Himmelwright mentioned earlier, there's the in-cost process that we have that develops that model, and that is just one tool in the toolbox. We do look at other information such as, vessel trip report data that Doug mentioned as well. So it's not, the in-cost model is, again, one tool to evaluate all these things, but we do look at other data sources that we even used in the call for information and nominations before we even got to the draft wind energy area. And in the final wind energy area still will evaluate other information beside the in-cost model. And the in-cost model itself may be updated based upon some comments received. So please keep those comments coming. And I appreciate Mr. Himmelwright's comments on the offshore areas especially. So and maybe while I do have the mic, I will say that this relationship with NCOS did first start in the Gulf of Mexico. We did announce that we are using it in this process in Central Atlantic. We'll be using it in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of Maine, and in Oregon as well. So it's not necessarily the same data that will be in each model, but we're coordinating to try to find the best available data for the region in which it's being used, and while also trying to be consistent between the regions in our approach. So I'm sure more to come on those as they develop. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks. Next slide. And then some ongoing things that we're doing in the policy arena. Actually, this is Brian's as well, in terms of we have BOEM has published the draft guidance document and opened a 60-day comment period. I was actually able to participate in several of those as I first came on board. So great feedback that we are receiving in terms of the guidance that we are going to issue to lessees in terms of their responsibilities for fisheries mitigation. We've received 88 comments, again, 79 organizations, 9 individuals. And at this point in time, I know Brian's fiercely working on incorporating all of those. He's got some reports to give later on this month to the BOEM leadership, but in terms of recommendations. But we are some time away from final guidance at this point in time, but definitely appreciated everything that we've received to date on this. Did you want to say anything more about that?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. All right, next slide. And another way that we solicit and incorporate input is the request for study ideas. We've closed this particular just this last week, just closed this year's round, but it's something that we just turn around and start over again. And so welcome input from anyone in terms of areas of study that BOEM should undertake. And we have a regular standing committee that in a process, and we work with the National Academies of Science on this as well. So this is something BOEM, while it has a history in oil and gas, if you look at that list of studies and go online and take a look, you'll see the portfolio is increasingly becoming offshore wind related. And we definitely, the OREP office has a seat at that table, and we get a lot of feedback also and input from the academies and from other stakeholders in terms of those studies. So definitely would welcome opportunities for areas of research in that regard. And I think that might be the last slide. This is just how you can contact us. And if, of course, you reach out to me directly, my email, but you're interested in being in a certain list, if in a certain notice, there's a way to go to our website and to click on and be on that mailing list and be sure to get the latest news in terms of announcements that are going to public registers and other things like that. But I wanted to just say in closing, we seek to have a process in which, BOEM as the lead coordinating agency has a responsibility to ensure that we are not only implementing the administration's goals, but doing this in a way that is environmentally responsible, that's economically sound, that takes into account the input of all stakeholders, ocean users, tribes, impacted communities. And I am taking on the responsibility, and as my role as chief, to ensure that we have accountability, clarity, and we are in transparency in our processes. And I'm looking for feedback, and I'm looking for input as to how we do that best and how we engage with you and help. And we acknowledge there is a tremendous amount of information that's coming out that we're asking input on and asking for review in short periods of time. However, we can do this in a way that's effective and incorporate your input, we are very open to those suggestions. And with that, I'll close for questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thanks, Brian, for the presentation. I think what I'd like to do is maybe go to Joe, because Joe had he didn't have a presentation, but he had some, to provide some comments. And then we'll open the floor for questions and comments to both presenters. So Joe Cimino, who is not only our New Jersey representative, but the vice chair of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I'm going to turn over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is going to be a bit of a pivot. I think the council members and hopefully most of the folks listening in are familiar with the fact that the states of Maine through Virginia have been trying to proactively engage in the fisheries elements of offshore wind as much as possible, starting back in the summer of 2021. 9 of those states, governors sent a letter to the Biden administration showing their support for offshore wind, but saying that there also needs to be support for the work that we're attempting to do, which is as was mentioned by BOEM, to keep the resources safe, make sure that BOEM and NOAA Fisheries and has the support that they need to ensure the resources are being protected, and that the commercial fishing industry and the for-hire industries are able to continue to operate and where needed, seek compensation. So in part, one of the original requests back in November of last year was the idea of guidance on compensation. BOEM took up that task, as mentioned, has put out a draft and are working on a compensation document that can be used eventually nationally. So, as a next step, the 9 states, again, this is Maine through Virginia minus Delaware, although Delaware has been participating, is a concept of a regional administrator once funds are made available. So today, 3 documents have been put out into the public, and I think Julia, who always keeps us well up to date on offshore wind issues, and Mary, who graciously has put all 3 of those documents in our meeting materials now on the website. So there's a scoping document for a request for information on the concept of a regional administrator for funds that will assume, eventually be put forward for compensation. This is a very broad document. The RFI itself is pretty small. It's a quick read. That's why I don't have any presentations for you. There's also a quick press release on this, and then a pretty important scoping document. This is somewhat unprecedented and not easy to tackle. So we've been very fortunate that the 9 states have been meeting regularly, not just the fisheries administrations for the states, but also the energy agencies for the states. We've met with NOAA Fisheries and BOEM to have discussions on this, as well as met with the wind energy companies and some in the fishing industry on, what exactly does this mean? We recognize that there could potentially be, and maybe there's a need for, federal legislation that helps move this ball forward. But in the vacuum of that, the states were not quite comfortable with just sitting around. So this request for information is pretty broad. We aren't as interested in where the money is going to come from as much as what happens once the money is made available. I think that's an important thing to consider. So as people are providing comments, you may not have an area of expertise that covers everything that's being suggested, but all information is appreciated, even if there's a specific element that you're willing to speak to. This is including for corporate and financial entities that might be interested in being that administrator. So the comment period is open. Again, this information just dropped today, and we'll be accepting comments through the end of January. Given all that we just saw BOEM present, obviously the timing of this is very tight. So our intent is to have all of this ready to go by hopefully spring of next year. And although the 9 states have worked on this, again, the intent is to build a framework for the Atlantic coast and hopefully something that is a template for the other coasts as well. So, Mr. Chair, again, I think I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer any questions. Hopefully you can get to the material and see exactly what we're proposing. One of the other things that will kind of dictate how this goes is what kind of funding comes in. We recognize that specific funding for specific compensation will go in one direction, but there may be multiple layers in what is getting funded as compensation. So, a separation between commercial and for hire. Are there resiliency funds that come forward that are outside of just direct compensation? So those types of things will all shape how this moves forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and I appreciate that information. I think at this time, I'd like to come to the table and to folks on the council that are participating virtually to see if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to raise to both presenters, both Karen, Brian, and Joe, for the information they provided us. Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joe, really appreciate that information and fully supportive of a regional approach to some sort of fund administrator. Brian and Karen, I attended, and Chief Baker, I'm sorry, I attended last week's meeting in New England, and I threw Brian a relative softball. We might call it grapefruit. It was big, and it was very easy to smack out of the park. But I have a couple of questions I'd like to address again today, ask you. I have asked them in the past, and I'm not sure if it's Chief Baker or Brian who's better able to answer these questions. So it wasn't real apparent in the presentation that you'd given, but you were talking about Central Atlantic areas. My question is was the Mid-Atlantic Broad Coral Protection Area or the Frank L. Lautenberg Coral Protection Area included in the model used to identify draft wind energy areas in what I believe is referred to as the Central Atlantic?
Take that.
So the answer is no, the broad area was not in the model itself. What was in the model, as I know, was observed coral, did make it into the constraints model. And I was having a conversation earlier, and I need to follow up on, I know we looked at model data. We had a BOEM funded study that I think it was with NOAA that modeled it pretty much in the whole South Atlantic, but extended it up into a bit into the Mid-Atlantic. And then there was a model developed for the designation of the Frank Lautenberg broad coral areas as well. That I know was looked at side by side, but my recollection is that did not enter into the actual constraints model of actually removing those areas for consideration. But the observed coral sites were removed from consideration in that draft wind energy area that was presented.
So two things. It's a little troubling that we went years of work to identify areas for protection that we feel are very valuable for protection, and maybe others not so much. This also comes, and I brought this forward before the Schuster horseshoe crab area off of the Delaware Bay. It's a protection area, sanctuary for horseshoe crabs, and there are wind energy WIAs on top of that. So it's a little frustrating that we work very diligently on setting aside sensitive habitat areas in regards to fisheries that are maybe not taken as in high regard within other agencies, and that's just my comment. I have another question, and throughout the years, you've heard various comments from this council and from the New England Council, and I'm just wondering what analysis of council comments and what changes have been made in response to all of these comments that we've given over the years. I mean, there are, somebody said they have a 1,000-page document. We've probably got between the two councils 1,000 pages worth of comment letters that we have submitted over the course of the past 4 or 5 years. And I'm just wondering if any of those comments are actually taken in consideration. And I've never ever seen a response to any of these comments, and I'm just wondering if there are any responses to these comments that we continue to submit, because we're asked to submit them, so we submit them. And it might be frustrating to individuals to understand that we submit them, but they kind of fall on deaf ears, and there's nothing other than maybe acknowledgement. Thank you, the acknowledgement email. Thank you for your comments. Just wondering what kind of changes have been made in response to comments. And it might be hard to answer at this point, but maybe you can provide something for us in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so again, I know, I think as we stated at the New England Fishery Management Council, and I think maybe Karen, after I'm finished, might reiterate, the feedback loop and, always willing to look at processes, improve upon processes. But I think what the piece I wanted to talk about is, I think it oftentimes depends on in what way we received the comment. So for comments on the EIS, there's a fairly standard way that we responded. There's a whole appendix in the EIS responding to the comments we got on the draft EIS. So that is definitely part of the NEPA process. And for like the call for information nominations, there's a summary document that we do post that says, here's some of the comments we heard. I think it's for the area identification memo that within the past few years has been a part of the record that we put on our website. We do talk about the kind of comments we got that went into identifying that area. Council considerations were included in that memo, for instance, for the recent New York Bight leases. And I know it can be frustrating if a comment, you can't directly see how a comment was reflected in a change. I know one thing that I did mention at New England Council, we were talking about, there's been a desire for programmatic EISs, prior to lease issuance. And I think if it weren't for those council comments, we wouldn't have really pushed that in-cost relationship, and also having a draft wind energy area and a final wind energy area and making each of those a public comment opportunity. Whereas before we weren't. We were trying to add as many additional comment opportunities like you would through a NEPA process in response to those types of comments. And regarding the Schuster Reserve or the Frank Lockenberg reserves, I mean, we do look at the information provided. We look at what the effects of our proposed activities may be, and what the regulations were around that type of activity. Whether the regulations around the Horseshoe Crab Reserve prohibited any bottom disturbing activities. I think it was only on the harvest of horseshoe crabs, so BOEM isn't harvesting horseshoe crabs, so there's not necessarily directly analogous type of action that the council took or NIMS took to protect that area. Again, similar on the deep sea coral areas, looking at the types of activities prohibited and what BOEM's activities may be in that area, and really trying to balance all the different objectives we have as an agency, with, as was in the presentation, balancing energy needs and impacts on the environment. So anyway, I don't know if Karen, if you want to talk more of that broader feedback.
Well, yes, and first of all, as Brian said, all comments are considered. All of them are taken into account. We cannot always act on everyone. We are working with a number of competing interests as we're working through our decisions. However, they go into the public record, and they are something that becomes part of that document regarding with those particular EISs. Having said that, and Brian addressed specifically some of the broader policy changes that I believe have come about as a result of the Fishery Management Council's input. That's something that I definitely am taking seriously. It's something that Director Lefton in her role has taken very seriously. And so being sure that we incorporate the voice from the Fishery Management Council as well as from individual fishery and getting out there and understanding and knowing those communities and their concerns is something that we've both taken to heart and are working to how we address that, how we better understand the concerns, and how we also make sure they're incorporated. So that's part of my reason for being here today, and it's part of what you probably see me more frequently than you'd like to as we continue to work together, hopefully. And I think that there's other things that we can do in terms of showing accountability, specifically in how we have incorporated those comments. So I did have an opportunity, as mentioned, to speak to the New England Fisheries Management Council, as well as to hear specifically from their leadership about how we could better work through that. And that's definitely something I'm looking to do as well here, and how we can, maybe be a bit more responsive, at least sharing with you how what you provided was taken into account and where we addressed it within those documents. But I think also more broadly, how we can have more engagement where we, sometimes I think it's hard on each of these with as many of the various COPs that are going through at one time to see where we do incorporate and do learn from each of them. But looking to how we can demonstrate and put that accountability into our processes also.
Thank you both very much for those answers. And you can certainly understand our little bit of frustration in BOEM has requested comments from us. We've both the regional councils and, you know, throughout, I'm guessing around the United States, through all regional councils, and not ever getting anything back in recognition of those comments can be very frustrating. And the only other thing I'll say about the horseshoe crab sanctuary is that might not be us you have to really worry about. It's those pesky red knots that fly from Tierra Fuego every year and feast on horseshoe crab eggs. Whether you harvest them or not, that there's going to be another bump in the road, so to speak. Thank you.
You had to say red knot. We're going to have about 300 more people on our webinar here in a few minutes. Okay, let's see who else we have. I'm going to stay with the council. We've got 2 hands. I'm going to go to Michelle Duvall and then David Stormer. You're up next, and then we'll go to the public. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both Brian and Karen. And I guess Peter stole my first question, which had to do with the coral areas. And so just a quick follow-up to Brian. With respect to the study that you referenced, I mean, that was one of the things that the council noted in its letter, that there wasn't additional information or like a link to that study. Has that study actually been published? So can we find it on the environmental studies page?
I'll have to follow up with you. I think we were I know we're like one step to getting on there. I need to double check if we actually published it, but I know we were very, very, very close and to the point that we could actually see it. So Michelle, I'll have to follow up with you if we actually did publish it yet or not.
Thanks. And then just, I guess maybe one more reflection, just with regard to the pace and scope of COPs that are moving forward and, you know, the recognition that there's a lot for stakeholders to comment on. And, you know, I'm wondering if you all have had a conversation about, you know, the fact that it's not, people are getting exhausted by the amount of pages that they're having to go through. And, you know, the fact that maybe there are not comments on something doesn't mean that there isn't interest in it and doesn't mean that there aren't impacts. It's just that, you know, folks have not had the opportunity to, you know, dig into a document as thoroughly as they would like. I think that goes for, you know, councils. We rely on our council staffs to take on that burden. But, you know, I'm curious if you all have had like a broader conversation about how to ensure that there's ample time for folks to respond, just given the staging of all of these different documents, and that, you know, absence of comment does not mean absence of interest, I guess.
We definitely take it seriously. It's definitely something that and Brian can probably provide. He can probably provide witness that I press the staff about this quite frequently, and it's something that we look at very carefully. I know that when we have those requests and where we have the opportunity, we can carefully consider and have extended comment periods where we need to. We also, the 4 notices of availability that are coming out before the calendar year. I just mentioned 2 today, but Empire Wind is out, as well as we have New England Wind, which will be published next week. We did, in effect, in cooperation with our interagency partners, determined to extend that comment period, especially noticing the time. especially noticing the volume of everything that's coming out at one time, and especially noticing, of course, that they were coming out so close to the holidays, in order to try to not only give people more time, but also to put together a very comprehensive and extensive public engagement plan that would allow us to engage with those communities and provide those opportunities for feedback.
Okay, thank you. I've got David Stormer next. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was talking to Chris. Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm just wondering, is there any way to pull up, I believe, slide 14 from Karen's presentation? The draft Central Atlantic wind energy areas? If not, no worries, but. Right, exactly. Thanks. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like the red polygons represent the sub areas that came out of the previous draft Central Atlantic area. If so, could you describe what is now represented by the open areas in the red polygons versus the blue and gold aliquots, or?
So the open areas, I mean, as we continue to work through the wind energy area and the area identification and then move into wind energy areas, we continue to scale them down. In fact, most times you see a scaling down after we look at the larger areas and get the input. So basically what's represented there is the change in the scope of the wind energy areas. Am I reading that correctly, Brian, or not?
Yeah,
I'm
no,
watching him.
I think that was, yeah, no, that was correct on the, why we have the outline of the call areas
That's
still
why
on
we
there.
have the outline.
But
and that's what,
you had a question on the primary and secondary areas as well, what the
Okay.
difference is on those.
the primary and secondary areas.
Yeah, the orange and dark blue. Dark
I
blue.
can't speak to it with
Okay.
looking at this particular map.
Okay.
There's an extensive discussion of how what each of those represents.
Okay, so when we put the draft call area out, we put in primary and secondary areas. So the dark blue is the primary, and the orangish yellow, I guess, or gold, I think as you referred to it, are secondary areas that we wanted to get additional comment on, even though the in-cost model, which is accompanying this, did rate those as being less suitable than the blue areas. So the blue areas were more suitable according to that in-cost model, but we wanted to get additional feedback on some of the gold areas. So we left those in as secondary areas to get additional comment on those. So all the blue and gold areas are the areas that we're focusing our comments on or requesting comments on right now.
And if you go to the BOEM website and look at this, there's specific questions and specific areas. If you look at each of these, and sorry, Brian gave a much more eloquent discussion of that. But if you look at each of these, and there's definitely, we have called out where we have questions and concerns and still have gaps in information and are welcoming input on.
Great, thank you. So is it fair to presume then that the distinction between the primary and secondary areas are perhaps conflicts with fisheries or habitat or issues like that?
Fisheries,
Or
DOD,
navigation?
national security concerns, navigation concerns, a number of different things that have been called out by in our research and by various stakeholders already as potential areas of concern.
Great, thanks. And the open areas are now no longer under consideration for leasing?
That is correct.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David, for your questions. I'm going to take one more question from the council. I have Lieutenant Commander Matt Cayley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation. One of the things that we're grappling with as an organization is how do we do search and rescue in and around these wind farms, especially as they go further offshore. And I saw on slide 3, it looks like your goals for the Mid-Atlantic from New York to North Carolina, there's about 50% completion that you project by 2030. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, moving forward, how you see the remainder of those goals being attained. Is that through further expansion offshore of the projects, or is that increasing the wattage of in the projects that are existing? Is that moving into different regions? Just kind of trying to get a sense of what you guys are thinking they're moving forward. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. And we do work really closely with the Coast Guard. In fact, I've got some meetings later on this week too, talking specifically about Central Atlantic. But to answer your question, we have our calculations right now of the 27 leases that we have that are in process. And I have to caveat this with a big if. If they all go forward as planned, which means the lessee sticks to the plan that the lessee has at this point in time, and if we deem that they are appropriate for permitting, and so they're permitted as that. If they're, so a lot of big caveats because we can't presume conclusion in terms of our regulatory role. But we believe we are at about 27 gigawatts by 2025 right now. The additional area, the additional power comes from the additional leasing areas, and that's sort of the general expectation at this point in time. And that's a very basic answer to your question. But of course, there's a lot that yet remains to be seen as we learn more and as we move out further into some of these other areas that we're currently looking at.
Thank you.
So a lot of assumptions and caveats in that answer.
Okay, thank you. All right, I want to ask the audience, is there anyone from the audience that may want to ask a question or have a comment? Okay, Megan, go to you first, and then I have Julie Evans online. So we'll take those two comments, and then we're going to take a quick break before we move into our next item on the agenda. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Seafreeze. I have a couple of questions, but my first question is, would BOEM consider an extension of the Equinor lease comment period? That's been a very contentious one for fisheries, but kind of as Michelle pointed out earlier, fisheries stakeholders are stretched extremely thin right now. We just finished up draft right whale comments. The Central Atlantic WIAs are out for comment. Equinor's out for comment. 2 more COPs dropped today. The RFI dropped today, and it's all over the holidays. And, you know, those of us who are trying to be diligent and, you know, read thousands of pages of documents are stretched very thin. And the 3 Equinor webinars, public webinars, were all scheduled during New England and Fisheries and Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council meetings. So, you know, I'm wondering if you would consider an extension of that comment period and maybe a couple extra public webinars.
So Equinor, you're talking about, I want to make sure that we're talking about Empire Wind. I just want to make sure because I think at this point, I can't answer that today, although that's something that if we are reaching the end of the comment period and there's some evidence that we need to do that, that's always something that we take into consideration.
My second comment is, Brian, earlier you said that the coral predictability model was not taken into account in your model, but you guys removed areas of known coral presence from the Central Atlantic WIAs. So with the lease areas that are up there on the chart that are in the coral zone, would you then need to have documented coral presence before removing any more of that area? Like, has that area been surveyed? And I'm just curious, like, unless somebody goes down there with an ROV and surveys the entire bottom there to look for corals, are people just going to be allowed to drop anchors?
Thanks, Megan. I mean, I think your question actually gets at a great point about the process. So I'm not aware of any studies right now where there's people are out on the water actually trying to document more coral areas that would be fed into the wind energy area identification process. But one of the things that we could consider, I don't want to get ahead of where we are in the process, but you know, if we ever were to issue leases in that area, I think one of the things that we've talked about is documenting all coral, being one of those first things, that requirement actually in the lease, so that very early on we can figure out if there are, some potential issues with a mooring design or a cable route or something along those lines, to be able to avoid impacts to coral species. But that's exactly the type of thing that we, as we go through our process, try to identify, okay, what do we take off the table prior to leasing, that we know we're comfortable, we have the level of data we need to actually remove it, versus what can we put in place at the lease issuance stage to say, hey, lessee, by the way, we know that there is some models that maybe show there might be some coral in this area. One of the first things we're going to need from you is to go out and survey your area to determine, if or where, areas that you might be able to impact are located on that particular leasehold. So anyway, that's definitely part of the process, and I don't have any information that we would have prior to any lease issuance in that area. And again, as I mentioned, the existence of coral is just one of those factors that we considered in the removal of areas from consideration.
Okay. I'll ask you a couple more questions offline. But one request that I would have that BOEM conduct is a coastwide ecological study looking at the effect of wind wakes from the wind farms. A couple weeks ago, there was a study that came out of Germany that showed a decrease of 10% primary productivity in the areas of wind farms and around them due to the wind wake effect, and it increased the sediment in the carbon in the ocean sediment, and it decreased the dissolved oxygen, and that has tremendous potential for impacts all the way up the food chain. And considering the leases that are up on the board, as well as the other leases that are on the East Coast right now, we could have major ecological consequences of the thousands of square miles that already are leased and the thousands of square miles that are planned for leasing. And that would be reflected in quotas, it would be reflected in decreased catch, it would be reflected in a lot of things. So I would request that a cumulative impact study be done on that particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for that.
Mr. Chair, can I respond?
Of course, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I think that's a great point. And we have recently awarded 2 projects for modeling wind wake and hydrodynamic impacts in the Mid-Atlantic. We've completed 1 to date in southern New England. And I think it's important when looking at some of these European models, which we definitely take into consideration, is also looking at the parameterization of those models. And we're doing a lot now, both internally and in discussion with the National Marine Fisheries Service on, the parameterization of the models. I think some of the more recent ones in the North Sea, I think we're still using a 5 megawatt turbine, which may be appropriate there, but you have to really look at the hub height, and the hub height on the larger turbines are far greater off there's a bigger air gap, and so therefore the stress on the ocean surface is quite different. So we have to really look at the model parameterization, what information goes in the model, because we get wildly different model results depending on what goes in the model. And I know the only model done to my knowledge in the U.S. East Coast is the one we published on our website, that didn't see those types of effects that the European model did with the that I think it was a 5 megawatt turbine. So definitely more to come in that sphere, and those all did take into consideration full build out and different permutations of build out, as well as modeling larval transport as a part of all 3 of now what will be 3 studies looking at that. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Brian. I'm going to take one last comment or question from Julie Evans online. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For those who don't know me, my name is Captain Julie Evans. I am the East Hampton Town Fisheries Advisory Committee, representative to the various federal and state organizations. I also was the representative, according to BOEM outline, for the fishermen here in East Hampton to offshore wind, position I lost because, in my opinion, at least, I asked some tough questions about getting fishermen compensated for their losses due to survey boat interactions. So I was quite pleased and will be looking forward to commenting on Joe Cimino's comments that he made at the beginning of this piece. I also would like to thank Brian and this a woman who was speaking, Karen Baker, for their participation today. We in East Hampton were kind of like the first community that hosted this sort of offshore wind preliminary reviews through BOEM, and we were treated through Deepwater, which was the predecessor of Ørsted, to many FETs and informational um, activities in order to present their best side, I would say, to the fishermen and why we should all get on board with offshore wind. And I'm not saying that fishermen here are against offshore wind. I'm saying that fishermen don't want to be put out of business by offshore wind. So compensation has been mainly a very tough thing to get. Some people have been, some people's requests have been denied. Questionnaires have been changed online without the representative, who was me, being informed of the changes. And so there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm not going to waste everybody's time doing that. But, you know, this whole thing is moving so fast, as I believe was said by many people here, that I think that, you know, as far as fishermen go, you know, we have to really slow down a little bit and pay more attention to them. And a national program to compensate fishermen for their losses in the both commercial and for hire sectors, I think would go a long way to do that. Um, um, that's pretty much what I have to say. And oh, I do have one more question, if I might. Um, um, a long time ago, we were able to close some dump sites in Long Island Sound that were recipients of toxic material. They were Army Corps of Engineer dump sites. Recently, the 4 dump sites have been reopened and a 5th one was added. We felt that there was a significant contribution to the downturn in catches in Long Island Sound at that time. This was like 93, 94. We were promised by the Clinton administration that Al Gore actually said that he would close these dump sites down. A lot of waste from Electric Boat, from the Army sub base building using, you know, highly toxic materials. I was curious if BOEM knows where any of that material that might be byproducts of manufacture or activities due to offshore wind, will that be going in the Long Island Sound dump sites? And what do they see going forward as far as waste? If somebody can answer that.
Thanks, Julie. This is Brian Hooker. I think so. You're talking about a decommissioning, the decommissioning side of things when
decommissioning, construction activities, whatever. I mean, are you going to be placing waste in the former 4, now 5 dump sites in Long Island Sound?
So I don't have any information about, you know, the where waste from the I mean, a lot of, the whole country, the whole world supply chain of supplying the materials for these projects. So I don't have any information there. I believe the type of information you're requesting might be more appropriate at that decommissioning application stage, where we do, evaluate, the decommissioning of the facility and I think what the final disposition of some of those materials will be at that stage, which is, I think, 2 years prior to decommissioning. But that's unfortunately all I can speak to at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Julie. I'm going to have to cut you off.
Okay, all right. Waited a while.
Yeah, if you need to reach out to Brian or Karen.
Or maybe the Army Corps of Engineers.
Or the Army Corps. Yeah, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves as far as our schedule, and we have a whole nother topic to cover tonight. So thank you for your participation, though, Julie. I appreciate the question. And
Thank you.
Brian, Karen, Joe, you were off the hot seat, which is good for you since you're usually on it, as I know very well, sitting in your position in the state of Maryland. So thank you all for your participation and discussion during this part of our agenda today. Brian, Karen, thank you for your presentation. We're going to take a 5-minute break and come back at 4:25. I really would like to stick to our schedule. So we'll have about an hour to discuss the Surfclam Ocean Quahog topic on our agenda this afternoon. So if we can get set up for that, we'll come back in 5 minutes. I will be starting at 4:25. Thank you. Okay, this is a 30-second warning. Get started. You got 30 seconds to get a soda, cup of coffee, back to your seat. We're going to get into it. Ten more seconds. So Chris warned me. I said, you know, Chris, I think I'm just gonna do a quick 5-minute break. And he said, well, it'll be 10 minutes. That's just the way it works. So I appreciate the insight from the professionals. Okay, so we are now at 4:30, a little bit behind schedule. I apologize to those folks who are online that were planning to participate in this next item on our agenda. But what I'd like to do, as I mentioned before, I'd like to really stick to our time limitations at 5:30 to wrap up the meeting. So I've spoken with some of the folks from the industry, and Jessica, who's a Jersey girl, she's going to try to rip through things pretty quickly. This discussion has been had many times over the course of the last few weeks, and there was a committee meeting recently where I know a lot of the folks that are interested in this fishery have participated and offered comments. So with that said, Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you. What we're taking up next, excuse me, on our agenda is the Atlantic Surfclam and Ocean Quahog Species Separation Requirements Amendment Final Action. And there was a committee motion from the committee meeting, but we'll get to that. And I'm going to turn it over to Jessica for the presentation, and then we'll turn it to the council for comments and questions. Go ahead, Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to review the history of the draft amendment and its contents in brief. We'll review the public comments we received on this draft action, review the recommendations of the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog Committee and the staff recommendations, and then the council will have the opportunity to consider whether it would like to take final action or not. Next slide. So the purpose of this action is to modify the species separation requirements in the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog fisheries. At present, you can only land Surfclam or Quahog on a fishing trip, so both species cannot be landed on the same trip. In addition, the cages on board are expected to be the trip's target clam species and ITQ tagged as such. So this action would consider regulations that would modify the ability to have mixed catches on board vessels. Next slide, please. So this action is needed because of the increased frequency of mixed catches in these fisheries. Surfclam and Ocean Quahog distributions are changing over time. It's also needed to maintain the data collection and monitoring of Surfclam and Ocean Quahog catches. As we know, mixed catches are presently occurring in this fishery, but they're not reflected in our current data streams. And it's needed because to be consistent with the individual transferable quota system, which requires cage tags and allocation for each species to be landed. Next slide, please. This issue was initially raised starting around 2018 by the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog fishing industry members. They raised this issue initially as an enforcement issue and were looking for some sort of tolerance for mixing in the cages. The council was asked to address this issue before the excessive shares amendment that was being developed for Surfclam and Ocean Quahog. At the time, the council chose to address excessive shares first. So work on this issue was initially added to the 2020 implementation plan for the development of a white paper. So during 2020 and 2021, a number of fishery management action team meetings were held, advisory panel meetings, committee meetings were held, and then the council initiated the amendment and the FMAT met to kick off that initial work. Next slide, please. So the council approved the draft for public hearings on October 4th, and the comment period opened with a press release on October 6th. The comment period on the draft closed November 29th at 5 p.m. On December 2nd, the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog Committee met to review the public comment that was received and develop recommendations for the council. So we're here today, and you have the opportunity to consider final action. Next slide, please. So back when this action was initiated, the council motion was to initiate an amendment that considered short-term solutions to species separation, including white paper option 3. And that was a option for onboard sorting. That's alternative 2 in the current draft document. And also request the staff and science center explore the feasibility of longer-term solutions such as electronic monitoring. I'll just note that staff is working with the Science Center on electronic monitoring, development and testing to electronically ID clams for the 2023 clam survey, and that project's been funded. Next slide. So the draft amendment itself, it's an environmental assessment under the National Environmental Policy Act. There are 4 alternatives within the amendment, the no action plus 3 action alternatives, and all of these alternatives were drawn from the 9 options that were developed and considered in the white paper. Next slide. So a quick overview of the 4 alternatives. Alternative 1, no action status quo, no changes would be made to the current regulations. Alternative 2, this would allow for a new combined trip declaration category. So you could have a Surfclam trip, a Quahog trip, or a combined Surfclam Ocean Quahog trip, and it would require onboard sorting. So the clam species would have to be separated. There would be no mixing of the 2 species within the cages themselves. Alternative 3 also allows for that combined trip declaration. It allows for the mixing of clam species within cages, but it would require a port monitoring of those contents. Alternative 4 also would allow for a combined trip declaration and the mixing of clam species within the cages, but this alternative would require electronic monitoring. So action items 2, 3, and 4. Next slide, please. So in terms of alternative impacts, impacts to surf clams and ocean quahog and non-target species are not expected. There are also not expected to be protected resources impacts from these alternatives. For habitat, there are slight negative impacts that are expected because of the continued prosecution of the fishery with the dredge gear, which may impact habitat. However, most of the impacts that are expected are going to be human environment and human community impacts. Alternative 1, the impacts would be expected to be slight negative at present to negative in the long term. And this is because of the potential for increased fishing operational costs and long-term degradation of the catch composition data collected for the management of these ITQ fisheries. Under alternative 2, impacts would be expected to be slight negative to slight positive. And this is because operating costs may increase for some trips and vessel processor groups. So that's the slight negative. However, it would allow for mixed catches and address the issue in the short term, slight positive. Alternative 3, costs associated with the new sampling program could be applied to the industry as a whole. That would be negative. However, it would also allow for mixed catches, improve the catch data, but it is a longer term solution than alternative 2, so slight positive. And under alternative 4, slight negative to slight positive, the costs associated with deploying an electronic monitoring technology to the industry could result in some slight negative impacts. However, it allows for those mixed catches, improves catch data, but it is a longer term solution, so it would be a slight positive there. Next slide, please. So in terms of shifting gears to the summary of the public comments, there are two documents, a written summary with comments that we initially received through November 23 in the first bundle, and the second bundle of comments that were received on November 28th and 29th are provided in a second bundle of materials. The comment period ran from October 6th to November 29. It was extended because we unfortunately had to cancel one of the public hearings. So we tried to add as many days, additional days as possible in the lead up to the committee meeting. There were 8 written comments that were received in total. There were 16 persons that cumulatively attended the 2 hearings, 14 unique individuals because 2 persons attended both hearings. And there were 8 sets of oral comments that were given at those hearings. And we were able to hold 2 of our 3 hearings. One of those hearings was online. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on some of the high-level themes that we received across the entire comment period. So one of those themes was that the requirements that clam cages contain single species, either surfclam or ocean quahog, that should be suspended, and there should be some kind of tolerance for mixing of both clam species in the cages. It was mentioned whether that's a % or a certain number of clams, that was something that should be considered. Many commenters noted that this issue was not about sustainability, but they felt it was about enforcement, and that there was no risk to the stock's sustainability by suspending requirements to allow for mixing in the cages. In addition, some noted that suspending enforcement in the short term would allow time for development of other industry-driven solutions, different solutions to identify and or sort clams. It was noted that some industry members were exploring other types of mechanical sorting or other kinds of approaches, but they needed time to develop those. Next slide. Overall, the comments generally were not supportive of action alternatives 2 and 3. There was some support of alternative 4, while some others noted they did not support alternative 4 because the electronic monitoring was not guaranteed to work. Some also indicated they were not supportive of alternative 1, which was the no action alternative, because doing nothing really is not a viable solution. There were also others that suggested mixing in cages should be allowed, that the estimates of the clams that were caught or discarded could be provided on the clam books or the vessel trip reports to document those amounts. And there were some suggestions in the comments about how that could be done, such as taking estimates by stopping the clam belts periodically or other kinds of approaches. Next slide, please. It was also noted that the industry didn't feel they had an opportunity to provide input in the development of the alternatives. It was also noted that some alternatives, such as alternatives 2 and 3, as described in the document, would lead to an increase in industry costs or government costs. However, they felt that these costs were not known with certainty and not documented well in the amendment. One comment was received in support of alternative 2, although that comment didn't give a specific rationale. It just said they felt it was a good approach. Another comment was received in support of alternative 3, and that comment noted that onboard sorting would be very difficult for vessels, so they were supportive of the port monitoring or some sort of shoreside approach to sampling. Next slide. So the committee was provided with all of the public hearing documents, comments prior to their meeting, as well as the hearing summary. And they met on December 2nd via webinar and passed the following motion. This motion is to delay final action on the species separation requirements amendment and task the FMAT with defining a percentage of mixing tolerance or allowance for both species and cages for an upcoming 2023 council meeting, And they felt that this action should be considered for inclusion on the council's implementation plan. It was passed unanimously. Next slide. I'm just going to hit a few highlights from the committee meeting. There is a summary with a little bit more detail that's provided in your briefing materials. So the committee felt that the tolerance issue for mixing of species within the clam cages was an area to focus on. There were some committee members that noted they understood the concerns of the industry, but they also had concerns about enforcement and being able to account for the species catch and track the catches of both Surfclam and Motion Quahog. There was also some discussion about if the vote for final action was put off, having a plan for what the next steps might be and having those be time certain. So it was clear what action would potentially happen in 2023 would be helpful. In addition, a committee member noted that the council should know what level of underreporting would create a sustainability issue. So they felt that that analysis should be conducted. They also felt that the committee probably needs to provide some additional guidance to the Fishery Management Action Team if they're to address these committee recommendations. The committee did discuss whether or not to recommend the removal of alternatives 2 and 3 from the document. However, they did not. And they also discussed different exempted fishing permit approaches and the possibility that industry members could apply for an EFP and explore different approaches to trying to address this solution or address this problem while collecting information. Next slide. So there's a staff recommendation memo that is also provided in your briefing materials. So the staff recommend that the council select alternative 2. Staff note that the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog are not overfished. Overfishing is not occurring, and only about half of the quota is presently utilized. So this is not a sustainability issue. However, the problem is that an unknown amount of non-target clams are being caught and mixed in cages on board the vessels. Those are being landed. They're either being processed or discarded at the processor. Some are thrown in the trash. At that step as well, they're not being reported. So we don't have a handle on the catch monitoring for both of those species and the extent of the mixing that's occurring. The system to monitor catch and enforce quotas is very strongly linked to the ITQ cage tagging system. So cages are tagged, there's different colors for both species. As cages of clams are reported, so cages of clams times the 32 bushels contained within those. And the enforcement relies really heavily on the cage tagging and looking at those tags to verify contents, because these are very large cages. So they're not something that is easily dumped. And in our discussions with Office of Law Enforcement and some of the port monitoring individuals, they noted that folks really aren't going inside them or going through them extensively to look at the extent of mixing. Next slide. So the analyses do suggest that this mixed bed issue is an extensive issue. The staff felt that alternative 2 addresses these issues in the short term, that the vessels could develop their own onboard operations and make choices about where they fish and how they sort clams into cages. The industry has all along indicated that vessels and processors have different needs. We have small vessels, we have large vessels. We have processors that are only processing surf clams or quahogs, some process both. But each operator can essentially develop their own onboard practices and develop their own technologies potentially to address this issue. In addition, I'll note that alternative 4, which was the electronic monitoring, may provide some long-term solutions. However, there are still some challenges associated with that kind of approach. Next slide. So after the committee developed their recommendations and passed their motions, and We've had some time to look at the staff recommendation memos as well. We just have a few additional staff comments to share with you. First of all, I think it's clear to everyone that this is a really complicated issue. During the development of this, the FMAT discussed how solutions really need to address several factors. One is the catch monitoring. One is the individual transferable quota allocation use tracking, because it relies so heavily on this tagging system, and the enforcement component of this as well. From new council training, some of you were just recently at that. The Office of Law Enforcement always has a slide that they put up that says regulations without enforcement are just suggestions. And measures really need to be developed so that they can be enforced and enforced in a practical way. So developing things that can't be enforced or monitored is really challenging. The staff and FMAT would definitely need some additional guidance on the intent of the committee motion that defining a percentage of mixing tolerance or allowance for both species and cages. Next slide. And one of the challenges for the FMAT in developing this is there's limited data available on the mixing and the catch, or what those mixing rates could potentially be if vessels were not avoiding mixed beds. So the industry has indicated to us that they are presently avoiding some of these heavily mixed beds. So those wouldn't be reflected in the very few observer trips that get sampled if they are actually avoiding those. And as I noted, we don't have any information in the logbooks or on or in the dealer reports as to what the extent of actual mixing is. So we don't have a lot of baseline data that's there. We do have two studies. The center has done some work and SCEMPIS has done some work that does show that there's pretty extensively mixed beds out there, and a large number of those in a large amount of area. And some of those documents are contained at in the appendix of the amendment. In addition, are there other measures that the council or committee would want to consider along with this tolerance? So is this a mixing tolerance in the absence of any kind of monitoring? Without monitoring what's in the cages, how do you know if any kind of tolerance level is being met or exceeded? What about enforcement of these mixing tolerances as well? How would enforcement handle that? So I think that would be an important question as well. And with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that presentation. So let me look to the council, whether you're online or in the room, if anyone has any questions at this time based on the presentation. Okay, yes, go ahead, Ken. Yeah, so I think the staff recommendation is what it is. It was a recommendation prior to that committee meeting. The committee took a different direction, but staff do not typically change their recommendation. It stays as a staff recommendation. That was part of the discussion for what occurs during a committee meeting. They're not going to. There was no other additional memo that changed the staff recommendation that I'm aware of, right, Jessica? Jose?
No, there isn't. There's a committee recommendation, and then the staff discussed this, and we developed our recommendation memo. So there was no modification.
Yeah, so, the process that I'd like, since seeing no hands, and thank you for the question, Ken. Seeing no other hands, what I'd like to do is go to Peter Hughes, who is our chair of the Surfclam Ocean Quahog committee, to offer up the committee recommendation. And if the council would like to substitute or amend that recommendation, they're willing if they're willing to, that's all fine. But I want to start with the committee recommendation since that's what the committee unanimously voted for. So I'm going to turn to Peter. I think we have it drafted and ready to go. And then what I'll do is I'll take discussion on the motion from the council. I'll go out to the audience. We'll see if anyone wants to change this at all, and then we'll finalize the action. So go ahead, Peter.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I do that, is there comment? Is there going to be a time to make comments, or you went to questions? I was just wondering if you're going to have an opportunity to make comments and then bring this motion forward, or you want to bring this motion forward first?
Yeah, based on the instructions that we got in Dewey Beach, I think putting the motion forward and having something to discuss is better than just to have general comments at this point. So we can start with the motion and go to comments from there.
Great, thank you very much. So this is a committee motion, and the committee motion was moved to delay final action on the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog species separation requirements amendment, and task the FMAT with defining a percentage of mixing/tolerance allowance for both species in cages for an upcoming 2023 council meeting. This action should be considered for inclusion on the 2023 council implementation plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and thank you for chairing that meeting. You did a great job. So Peter Hughes is making this motion on behalf of the committee. Because it is a committee motion, it does not need a second, and therefore I will open it up for discussion to the council at this time. Is there anyone in the room? Joe Semino.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. This was a tough committee discussion, but I want everyone here to keep in mind that, industry came to us with a request to look at this, and we have, and I appreciate all the staff time and all the effort that was put into this. And I'm sure that when we get their comments, they'll explain just how nearly impossible it is, how, pretty much unviable these options are, even though we've looked into it as in-depth as we can. So I certainly can't support staff's recommendation in good faith. I do think we need to delay and have a greater conversation on, what does a tolerance mean? As far as the challenges to monitoring this in law enforcement, those challenges exist right now. That's not going to change. What is going to change is what are the estimates that come forward, because we know there will be some mixing, but we know there's some mixing now. And industry doesn't have any motivation. I hope they'll speak to this as well, to attempt to fish in these great mixed beds when they get back to the processing plant, since they can't handle that. So I do think we need to explore some of the stuff that the committee has talked about. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Joe. I'm going to go over to Garfo, Mike Pitney.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to understand in motion, task the PD, the second part of the motion, tasking the PDT with defining a percentage of tolerances. Would that be a new alternative that would be added to the document, an alternative 5, before it comes back to the council? Or how does the maker of the motion, or the committee, I guess, in this case, intend to, how is the committee envisioning this tasking to inform a final action at some point in 2023? Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Mike. And maybe I'll say a few words and then I can turn to staff or Peter. But I was able to participate in the meeting, and it sounded to me like the options that were presented were not going to work, and that the industry was planning to go back and develop something new that would go into the document. I believe that's what I remember. It was only a couple weeks ago, but I'll turn to Peter. You're much more involved in it than I've been. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, you're correct, Mr. Chair. That was the discussion. And as if you saw in the presentation, that there was discussion about removing alternatives to 2 and 3 from the considered but rejected bin. And the committee decided not to take any action on that. It's a much bigger problem than I think that anybody really anticipated. But Mike, if you want to follow up, go ahead, and then I can make other comments.
Go ahead, Mr. Penny.
I guess this would be a question for staff. Jessica, you mentioned during your presentation that at one point the FMAT and the working group had, I think, 9 alternatives that were sort of sketched out, and those got winnowed down to the 3 functional alternatives that were in the document. And I'm just wondering if what the committee is suggesting was ever contemplated among the 9, and if it was, can you give us a little bit of insight as to why it was removed before we got to the 3 that are currently before us?
Jess?
So early on in the process, the FMAT did talk through some of the options with a potential for a % mixing in them. And I think it was at our first FMAT meeting. And some of the challenges were with that % mixing were, one, that it's without having a process to be able to enforce that. As I noted in the staff comments at the end, it's a regulation that potentially could be unenforceable, that the enforcement isn't equipped to go dumping all of the cages out and sort of going through them and checking for the tolerances. So that was one issue there. In addition, at the time, we were looking at a variety of sorting options that are in those 9 options. So activities that could happen on board the vessel or on board the port, or also happen at the dealer or processor, different levels of monitoring to ID and to sort. And then early on, I think one of the other challenges for the FMAT was with that tolerance component, particularly on the stock assessment side. It was our stock assessment scientist, Dan Hennon, was having sort of these unknown mixes coming in presents challenges and kind of degrades the data streams for the stock assessment. So if you have this mixing, but then you don't have a sampling or a monitoring to get a handle on what those numbers are, then that potentially can have an effect on the assessment and on their data streams going into that. So there were definitely some concerns on the stock assessment side for those data streams. So I mean, we did talk around a lot of these approaches, and that's really where, in terms of the options that were developed, the options that were retained, I think in the set of 9 were related to either having the ability to sort them either mechanically or manually. So that's like the onboard sorting them into separate cages and then being able to tag them so that you still have the integrity of the ITQ tagging to track allocation use, because that's another issue. That's sort of that third component is that ITQ piece, or having some sort of means to visually ID the clam species, like the electronic monitoring, or having some sort of port sampling that gets into there and get us handle on that. So we talked through a lot of those, and I know early on in 2021, prior to the council motion to include option 3, we did have discussions with the fishing industry as well, which is why that alternative 2 was included in there as well, because at the time they seemed to think that the onboard sorting might be a shorter term solution until more viable longer term solutions could be developed. And so that's why that's also included there.
All right, thanks, Jessica. Anyone else around the table? Anyone else on the webinar? I think we're at the, I think discussion would be the point in time that we're in right now. Peter, did you have something you'd like to discuss?
I did, Mike, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to. I'm removing my committee chair hat and I'm putting my council person chair hat on. You all know that I come from a commercial fishing background. And when I unload a boat at the dock, the boat says go summer flounder fishing. He comes in with 50 boxes of summer flounder, 5,000 pounds of summer flounder. You know what? But he's also got a handful of black sea bass. He also has a handful of squid. He has a handful of scup, and maybe some blowfish or something else. Maybe 2 mackerel. Whatever the boat's allowed to have permits for, and whatever gear he's fishing with, he knows what he needs to be able to fish within those parameters. But I, as the dealer, need to unload all that fish, and I need to account for it, and I need to size it properly, and I need to be able to account for it, and I need to report it to National Marine Fisheries Service. That takes place every day. Anybody that's ever unloaded a commercial fishing boat, that's how it works. We're required to report. There are state police that come around, or our local environmental police that come around to check on us. OLE comes around to check on us. The Coast Guard pops their head up every once in a while to check on us, just to make sure that we're doing our jobs. And that's our reporting requirements. And now we have there's 2 species that are commingling due to climate shift, climate change, whatever we want to call it. And neither of the species is in jeopardy of being overfished. As a matter of fact, they're fished very well below their ABCs, as we all know. 50 to 60% on an annual basis is what's harvested. We just need to be able to count the other fish that they're coming in with. And it seems like an easy problem, but it's not, because things move so quickly out at sea, and it's very hard to slow things down out at sea. And imagine, if you will, in the wintertime when there's ice on the deck and you're trying to slow things down and you're trying to throw these, softball size, grenades over the side of the boat so that you don't jeopardize your entire landings. We dealt with something called the scout meat count. Scout meat count scared everybody to death. There were captains that would unload our dock, and if the state guys were there, if OLE was there, they would physically be sick over the side of the rail of their boat, because they were so scared that they were going to come outside of the meat count. And when these guys, the threshold for the meat count at that point was 30 meats per pound, and it was a 10% threshold. So if you had 33 meats per pound, you were in bounds, and below the meat count. If you had 34 meats per pound, your trip was going to be confiscated. Those same realities are there with this. And what seems like something that's very easy, and it should be some sort of a reporting requirement from the dealer, has now evolved into this very difficult, challenging, kind of realization that's in front of us. So I'll stop there, Mike, and hand it back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comment there, Peter. And since this motion now is the property of the council, you can absolutely speak freely as a council member. You don't need to qualify that before you start. So just so everyone knows, that's it's totally acceptable and fine. Anyone else around the table have anything they'd like to offer for comment on the motion? Sonny Gwynn?
Chair. Peter, could you explain that, or maybe the clam industry can? But when the clams come to the processor, they can't, and they're surf clamming, they can't take the quahogs. Well, what do they do with them?
Go ahead, Peter.
So if you're a surf clam plant only, you don't want any quahogs. Same thing with a quahog plant. You don't want any surf clams. But they cannot commingle the meats in their packaging products, in their final products, because the meats are completely different. One, the coloration of the meats are completely different. So if you have a quahog in with a fresh chop, say surfclam, you're going to see that there's something different in that packaging, and it's very off-putting and not appealing to consumers. But I will let the clam industry answer that question better.
I think what I'm asking, I think what I'm trying to ask is, so when they come out of there, do they take the quahogs and set them over here and just do this with surf clams?
Can they count them by doing that? Yes.
That's what I'm getting at.
Okay, thanks for that. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I feel like a little bit of an honorary member of the Surf Clam and Ocean Quahog Committee, since I had to pinch hit for Peter on the one of the public hearings. But I mean, it seems like even defining a percentage of mixing, some tolerance still isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. So there's still this issue of, law enforcement and also of accounting. So trying to determine, even if there is a tolerance that's established, are in terms of accounting and thinking about the science and the stock assessment, do you just assume that 5% tolerance or, whatever is within every cage? I mean, so I think, it is a very complicated issue, as Peter noted, and I really didn't have that big of appreciation for it until the public hearing when I got to hear from industry. So, I mean, I appreciate all the comments and that industry has provided. And, this is obviously something that industry wants to solve since they're the ones who brought it to the council in the first place. I just, I wonder if defining that percentage is going to really get us to the end result that we need, or if we need a different accounting system. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. And I hope my response to you from what I heard doesn't cause a stampede from the folks in the back of the room. But the way that I see this is a starting point. It was something that was discussed by the industry and by the committee members. And if something different surfaces as a result of discussions, then this would be a starting point for possible considerations of all different alternatives. That's kind of how I envisioned it. I don't know. I look around to some of the members of the committee that may have been able to participate a little bit more than I, but that's what I'm thinking. Joe?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think one thing that, I mentioned in the committee was that, council members may need some level of comfort, so that's part of what the FMAC could be tasked with, is helping us understand what level of underreported in either species becomes an actual concern for the resource. That's one starting point. And two, assuming an assessment can do sensitivity runs with various levels of harvest, then, can we find the ground truthing? What percentage of trips can, we ground truth that to understand, there's a want to avoid these, right? So at what level of reporting can we get to, and observations can we get to just ground truth what is being estimated or assumed as that level?
Okay, thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. Anyone else at the table? Okay, seeing no hands from council members online, there was one more thing that I've spoken with Chris and Wes about regarding this motion, and it has to do with the implementation plan. discussion. And we are going to finalize our implementation plan for 2023 in, I think it's Wednesday. We're going to do the implementation plan. And I just want folks around the table to understand that by whether or not you support this or not, we have, so if you think back to our implementation plans and how they're put together by fishery management plans and species, and you can either add it into the plan for 2023, or you can have it under possible additions for something that could be worked on potentially in 2023, but may not happen if there are other priorities that the council wants to pursue. So in discussions with our council leadership here, that decision has yet to be determined. And so if we were to approve this at this point, it doesn't mean that 2023 is when final action will be taken, unless the council decides in its implementation plan discussion that something else has to come off the board in order to place it into the list of action items for 2023. It could go into possible additions, and if there is time, there's a potential there. So that discussion is yet to be had. I'll look to Chris to see if there's anything maybe that I might have missed on that, but that's what we've talked about.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, well said. We don't have a 2023 implementation plan yet. The reason we don't have one is because we haven't taken action on it. So that action is scheduled for Wednesday. We do have a draft implementation plan. That draft implementation plan was by the executive committee at our last meeting. As I said at that particular meeting, the actions in that plan, the ones in the list, basically represented a full plate for council staff. So as we get into our conversation on Wednesday, if this motion passed, we'd have that conversation relative to this particular action. That conversation would be that we've added, this motion passes, we've added this action to our list for possible additions. So we need to have that understanding. And if we get to the conversation on Wednesday, we see that it's on the list of possible additions, and there's someone around this table that wants to move it up in the list for action in 2023, then we're going to have a hard conversation about what comes off that list relative to the other items that are there. So we'll have that conversation on Wednesday. I think that it's going to be pretty straightforward, and I think that's it. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Chris. Any questions regarding the implementation plan? Mike?
Yeah, I'm still just trying to think this through then. If we pass this motion and then on Wednesday, we don't make this a priority, what happens to the amendment? Does it just disappear for another year and then possibly pick it up in 2024?
That's exactly right. If it goes on to possible additions and it doesn't surface, if it doesn't surface based on availability, it will just be delayed. So 2024, if the council decides at that time they want to move forward with it. But I'll go back to Chris for any specifics on that.
So yeah, that would be the idea. Possible additions means that we may possibly get to it in 2023. So there may be some action in 2023 that will pertain to this particular action, and we might do something on this particular action, but more likely to occur in 2024. So the motion says the action should be considered for inclusion on the 2023 council implementation plan. So that could mean that we add it to the possible addition list. That's what I'm hoping folks mean that this motion passes today, so that we can have the discussion on Wednesday as to whether or not we want to move it up in the list or keep it under possible additions.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for clarifying that. That's what I thought we were going to do. But I mean, it does seem to put the industry at considerable risk, because if we pass this motion, take no action now on the amendment, and then on Wednesday we find ourselves not able to make it a priority for 2023, then the enforcement risk continues without an end in sight as to when this may get addressed to resolve the issue that the industry has brought forward, and that they, they will remain at risk, particularly as these mixed beds become more and more prevalent.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Mike. And given your question, or your comment, I guess, regarding industry, I think what I'd like to do at this time, seeing no other hands around the table and no one from the webinar with their hand up, I'd like to go out to the public for any comment that anyone might have regarding the motion before us. Dr. Roger Mann, and then Sam. I couldn't see your head. I wasn't sure who that was. I'll come to you, Sam, after Roger. Former council member, Roger Mann. Go ahead, Roger.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, thank you for the opportunity. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Roger Mann. I'm a professor of marine science at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I had the privilege of sitting on this council for 3 years as a delegate from the Commonwealth of Virginia. I sit here today wearing both my professor hat, and for those of you who've worked through the tab that describes this, there's a map in there. It was created by something called SEMFIS, the Science Center for Marine Fisheries. I am one of the co-principal investigators on that center, partially funded by industry, partially funded by the National Science Foundation. Okay, there are 5 quick things I'd like to address here. One of them is the context of the problem. The second one is a little bit of history. The third one is what does the science say for this problem going forwards in terms of the resource? The fourth are the options that have been placed before you by staff. And the fifth one is this that's sitting up here. So let's start with a bit of context. As Jessica has noted, this is not a sustainability issue. Neither of these stocks are overfished. Overfishing is not occurring. Neither of them are anywhere near the quotas. So this isn't a problem about whatever happens here, taking away the stock that's out there. For the council, this is, as you pointed, it's a reporting problem. You can't do your job if you don't get the numbers. It's a monitoring problem. Dan Hinton and the center can't do their job unless they get things. And it's an enforcement problem. I mean, it's an enormous problem when you can't enforce something and you don't know where you're going with it. It's very frustrating for you. I'd say that for the industry, it's even more frustrating. For them, yes, it's a compliance problem, but it's an enormous economic problem. You pay boats to bring in one or the other. Your conversations with your customers are about one species or the other. There is no room in this for mixing, as Peter has already pointed out. This is an imminent and major economic problem as to how they deal with separating this stuff that comes back from the dock. So they want to solve this thing probably even more than you do. So I think there is no shortage of momentum on either sides about how you do this. A little bit of history, because it places my science comment in context as well. In 1933, a long time ago, Henry Bryant Bigelow wrote a massive paper describing the physical oceanography of the Middle Atlantic Bight. One of the really interesting features of that is this cold pool of Arctic water that sits on the bottom in the middle of the shelf in the middle of the summer. In 1969, Art Merrill and John Ropes, both of them from the National Marine Fisheries Service Lab in Woods Hole, described the first ever comprehensive distribution of surf clams and ocean quahogs. And lo and behold, if you take Art's data and you put it on top of Bigelow's data, what you see, in fact, is what we all know now. All the surf clams are inshore in the warm water, all the quahogs are offshore in the cold water. This made management easy. If you wanted to go fish for one, you stayed inshore of the thermocline. If you wanted to go fish for the other, you went out into the cold pool. It also allowed you to move forward with the management protocols that you have now, which is tagging cages, because it was easy to separate stuff. Surveys have continued over the years. The last time this area of major mixing in the Middle Atlantic was surveyed by the center was 2016. The map that you have in your tab is September 2021. Basically, if you start at the Hudson Canyon and you go south, there's a swath from 40 to 55 meters out there where there is mixing all the way south to the Virginia Capes. This is a giant piece of real estate. So if you don't want to get mixed catch, you either have to go offshore of that to get Quahogs, which is a substantial steam, or you stay inshore of it if you want surf clams. I talk to a lot of captains. I've been to sea with a lot of them. This is becoming intractable. And why should you avoid it? Because out in this area, there is a rapidly expanding surf clam resource. It is moving outwards because of climate change and as the area is warming. But the quahogs are not going away. The quahogs, when it gets warm, they simply bury deeper into the sediment and they wait for winter to come back again. This large area of overlap has got the biggest, the fastest growing, the most productive quahogs anywhere in the world. If you're in the quahog business, this is a target that you want. If you look at all of the projected models for the Middle Atlantic and out onto the shelf also south of New England. Now, there are no comparable surveys south of New England, but I will bet you all a good dinner that the same thing's happening out there. This area of overlap, this ecotone, is getting bigger, and it will continue to get bigger. So as we see this, we are going to see a gradual, but I say gradual, over the course of decades, movement of ocean quahogs out into deeper water. So this is a problem that is going to exist for a long, long time. Most of us will be in the ground by the time we sort of see these things finally separate again. And if warming continues, it's really not going to stabilize at all. So with that very dire sort of prediction, let's look at the 4 options that you have out here at the moment that staff has presented.
Roger, if you could, I mean,
Yep.
no disrespect.
Yeah, I'll get there. 1, not acceptable. 2, can you sort at sea? I've spent a long time on these boats. You can't do this. 100 cages on a boat, 32 bushels a cage, 90 to 150 animals per bushel. Caught in 18 to 24 hours, the rate at which they come across the belt in front of you is 3 to 5 per second. You can't sort them. If you want to try doing this at night in February in a 6-foot sea, when it's snowing, it's not tractable. Sorting at sea just doesn't work. Now, sorting at the plant, I'm going to leave that to these guys. Electronic monitoring, I've tried those. It has some significant problems. We're not going to solve it, and we're not going to solve it because there's a lot of cracked material that comes out of these dredges as well. So it's not this shape versus that shape, it's everything in between. Everybody's frustrated. That is a good place to start. I would encourage you to support this amendment that's up here, because there's no more people who are frustrated than this than the people who are sitting behind me. And certainly as a scientist, I think that's a good representation of where we are at this point in time. Thank you. I apologize for taking so much time.
No, thank you for your comments, Roger. I appreciate that. And I don't have any hands online, but Sam, do you have anything in addition to add? And if you could keep your comments to something new, that would be fantastic. Whether or not you support this or not would be a first start, and then any additional information would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, and all the work the staff has put into this. Sam Martin, Atlantic Cape Fisheries, Scallion Seafood, and Atlantic Harvesters. We do support this, but I will say that we do need some action in the future. I was originally a proponent of alternative 2 because I figured it would reduce regulatory discards. It would give us an opportunity for the crews to incentivize their catch when it comes to getting paid for things that they were throwing overboard. I will say none of the alternatives really get us out of legal jeopardy. And that is the issue here, which has not really been commented on. And I do believe that during the committee, it was said that there would be some comments towards that if one of these alternatives would propel us towards a conversation with enforcement so that we could realize that we could move towards some action in the future that would help with our accounting problem, which I believe needs to be narrowed down to the closest point of separation, which I do believe is at the processing plants. Then we could get a true accounting of what we're doing. I have fished my entire life. I've been in all different fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic, and I do realize that catches come in mixed in different variations based upon your permit base, and we separate them and we account for them and we put them in safest. And that's how we actually account for our catches when it comes to our scientific sustainability. So I support this, but in a way, I don't want it to be delayed very far because we're continually in legal jeopardy without some type of pathway or vehicle in order to get there. If it means we have to have an alternative today, then I would have to say I support two because it helps prevent some of the things that I just previously said. Although the biggest issue here is enforcement. This is not a problem that came to us, that we brought in. It came to us, and we're trying to fix it, and that's why we brought it to you. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sam, very much. And I think your last point about how the council takes this on, if this motion were to pass, would be a little bit larger discussion on Wednesday when we're talking about implementation. So, with that said, I'm going to bring things back to the council at this time. Are there any comments? Let me go to Dewey first, and then I'll go to Mike, and then we'll call the question.
I don't see how this council is going to fix the problem that needs to be addressed. I think it could be by industry, and it needs some time. But I don't think the council, we're not the ones in the plants. We're not the ones on the boats. And so we sitting around the table. Industry is something they're going to have to work on, but give them time to work on it to get to a end point or something maybe, because us around this table here is not going to tell how to work a boat or a machinery or a plant. So I don't see how that industry or the council is going to be able to achieve or fix this, because we're not there.
Yeah, we're definitely not the experts in this fishery. And I think that's what started this discussion about some delay, because the industry didn't see the options that were in the amendment at this time as alternatives that they could work with. So I would, and I believe that the industry is very willing to put their heads together to try to come up with something new. And as I mentioned before, I think this motion starts a starting point for those further discussions. So I appreciate that, Dewey. We'll go to Mike Penny, and then I've got Michelle Duvall next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I'm gonna support the motion because clearly this isn't ready for final action today. There's too many unanswered questions, and I do think we need to take a step back and look at this. But we've heard a couple of, this is an enforcement problem. It's not a biological resource problem, and I can't disagree with either of those. But I'm still concerned that this is also a problem for the integrity of our ITQ system, and that's something that I think this council should care about and should be thinking about in crafting solutions. If we were just managing, quota managed species like black sea bass or scup, what comes off the boat is less relevant, as Peter Hughes said, to what happens at the dealer when the dealer identifies waste species and submits a dealer report. That's clearly what we use to ensure the integrity of our management system for those quota monitor species. But these are ITQ fisheries. And I think that means that we need to ensure that at the individual trip, individual allocation holder level, that there's integrity in the system. And when you look at, and this is, a hypothetical kind of worst case scenario, somebody loading up on Quahog tags because they're easier to come by and they're a little less expensive, and landing as many surf clams as possible in each of those Quahog tags because you get better value for surf clams, assuming that they've got somebody that's willing to take them. At some point, the ITQ system breaks down without a way to manage that, effectively. So I'm just throwing that out there as something that I've been thinking about and is a concern to me as we work through this issue. But like I said, I'm going to support the motion. I do think we need to take a step back and work on this some more. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just really quickly, I also am going to support the motion, and I echo a lot of the concerns that Mr. Pentney just raised with respect to accounting and the integrity of the ITQ system. And I think I'm hopeful that, as you stated yourself, Mr. Chair, this would be like a starting point, and that some of those issues could be ironed out in the subsequent conversation, which presumably would also involve, taking things to the advisory panel. Okay, thank you.
And that okay was prefaced by my nodding. I think that's the agreement that I think we all have. I'm going to take one last comment. Chairman of the New England Council and our liaison to New England, Mr. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question is for you. You made a comment earlier about the motion itself. The motion says task the FMAT with defining a percentage of mixing tolerance or allowance. I mean, setting a number gives me heartburn. So that immediately it creates another enforcement issue. But I think the comment you said was this is a starting point, and maybe this will lead into different paths or different discussions. That's not what this motion says, but if that's the intent, then I would support the motion. If it's not the intent, then I would not support the motion.
In my mind, that's the intent. I'm going to look to Peter, who chairs the committee, as a kickoff, as a starting point for discussions with the AP, with folks who are very knowledgeable about the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog fishery. Would you see this as some form of a starting point for discussion? And it could evolve through discussions with the AP, with committee, with staff on the FMAT?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. I see it as not just this one tasking to the FMAT, but there has to be additional input from the advisory panel and the committee in with that tasking, because there may be some other ways to look at this. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Eric Reed raised a good comment, and so maybe I'm gonna, with your indulgence, make a motion to amend.
You're welcome to.
All right. I would move to amend to replace the first, to change the first sentence after and. So I would say delay final action on the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog species separation requirements amendment and remand the amendment to the committee and FMAT to continue to develop alternatives for an upcoming 2023 council meeting. And then the third sentence would remain the same. And my intent there is, if I can get a second, then my intent would be to simply ensure that we have sufficient working space to think this through and not just be constrained by the words that are on the board in terms of a tolerance threshold. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for that. Peter Hughes, are you seconding that motion? Okay, I think it's a good choice of language based on some of the comments that we've already received around the table about where this committee and AP and council will go. So is there any discussion on that motion? Mike already provided some rationale. I'm not going to go back out to the public at this time, but is there any discussion at the council? Everyone just give me 1 second. Chris and I are Just having a little sidebar about process. Okay, so what we're discussing is the fact that the original committee motion had language specifying that the report on this work would be during an upcoming 2023 council meeting. And since we haven't necessarily included it in the implementation plan, but we have the opportunity to put it into possible actions for 2023. And if that's where the council decides to put it, then I think we're okay with that. But I saw Pat Gear with his hand up. Pat, did you have a comment on where this stands?
No, sorry. So I was replacing the task, the PDT or FMAT phrase with the remand phrase. Yes, yes. Thank you for catching that.
Now your mic's on, Pat, after you stop talking. Go ahead and turn your mic off. You Virginia guys over there. Okay, does anyone else have any comment on this? Chris Moore?
So this is an important point. If you read this, so given my earlier comments, which were, we don't have a 2023 implementation plan yet, right? We said that the possible discussion on Wednesday may take this from a possible additions category to an action item category for definitely for 2023. We now say in here that we're going to have a meeting, so remand the amendment to the committee and the FMAT to continue development of alternatives for an upcoming 2023 council meeting. So that now says that we actually have to do work in 2023 to make sure that we have this meeting in 2023. So one way around it is to say, again, to give us room to talk about it on Wednesday, is to say possible in front of upcoming 2023 council meeting, right? But it's up to you. That's not what the committee said. So again, you really need to think about it. If you just add that word possible, I think we're fine from my perspective. Again, we could have the conversation on Wednesday as to exactly how we want to handle this particular action item.
All right, I appreciate that clarification, Chris. Mike has nodded and said that he would be willing to add that word possible. Peter, how do you feel about that as second to the motion?
Thank you. Good.
Okay, well, we'll take it as a friendly amendment. So we have alternatives for a possible, okay, I see it now. Any further discussion on the motion? Motion to amend. Okay, I see two folks online. I'm going to take those two hands, seeing no other hands in the room, and then I'm going to call the question on the motion to amend, and then we'll have to call the question again as the main motion. So, David Stormer, go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, I guess, was looking for some clarification. I think Jessica mentioned it in her presentation, and it seemed clear during the committee meeting and just now by Mr. Pentney's remarks that approving the motion to delay final action on the amendment irrespective of whether it makes it on the 2023 implementation plan, does not delay the development of electronic monitoring, for example, or alternative 4 of the amendment. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Last comment, Maureen Davidson.
Thank you, Mike. I'm just going to be a little fussy about the language, and I wanted to make sure what the amendment says is clear. Move to delay final action on the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog species separation requirements amendment, and remand the amendment to the committee and FMAT to continue to develop alternatives for a possible 2023 council meeting. Is that what that's supposed to say?
That's correct. That was the adjustment that we made. I think that's the way I read it. It sounds right. I've got Scott Lennox with his hand up. Did we make a mistake?
I kind of, yeah, I'm sorry. I agree with Maureen. I think it's just the grammar. If you read that sentence.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure that the amendment read correctly if we were to make any more changes to it. Thank you.
Yeah, it could have been development of alternatives, but it said develop alternatives. So we changed it. I think we're in good shape at this point. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and read the motion into the record since we made a couple adjustments to it from the initial motion, and then I'm going to call the question. Motion is move to delay. This is a motion to amend the original motion that says move to delay final action on the Surfclam and Ocean Quahog species separation requirements amendment and remand the amendment to the committee and FMAT to continue to develop alternatives for a possible 2023 council meeting. This action should be considered for inclusion on the 2023 council implementation plan. I'm going to ask the council at this time, is there any opposition to this motion? And the reason I ask that is I have not heard. Yeah, Maureen, there you go. Maureen took her hand up. I haven't heard anything on the negative side, so I'm going to try to simplify this. Seeing no one in the room with their hand up and seeing no one online with their hand up for objection, the motion carries by unanimous consent. Thank you very much. This becomes now the main motion. I am not going to read it again, but I'll ask the same question. Adam, do you want to offer comment on the main motion now?
Just one comment at this point. I just think we need to make it very clear to industry that this is going to require redevelopment, likely going to require going back out for public comment. Again, if we have new alternatives, is my guess, they're probably not going to be in the scope of what there is. May or may not be on the implementation plan, then has to go through final rulemaking. A best case scenario for this implementation is maybe 2026. So certainly not before 2025 at the earliest. So I think it's just important that we set that expectation for ourselves and for industry as we move forward with this, and so that they could plan for what they think they need to do in the interim.
Yeah, I think that's a good comment. And it's difficult to say what the timing is going to be based on the discussion we have regarding the 2023 implementation. But that's a good point. We have the industry here. They've heard your comment, and I appreciate that comment. But it will delay this final action, which I think is where we're going to end up here today. So, any additional comment now on the main motion? Is there any objection to the main motion? Any objection from any member of the council on the main motion? Seeing none, this motion now passes as the main motion by unanimous consent. Jessica, is there anything else that needs to come before us at this time regarding these final actions?
No, there is not, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I want to thank you and thank Jose. You'll be staying with this plan for a little while, I guess. Still, you got a little more work to do, but thanks for all your time and effort. Thanks for the industry for being here. I'm going to turn things over quickly to Chris to announce hospitality.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two things to announce. First, hospitality. It's in room 632. 632. Second, we're going to do our annual council photo Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock. And I'll remind you again tomorrow. Thank you.
And since we have a long day ahead of us tomorrow with our colleagues from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, I'm implementing a 10 o'clock curfew for all of you. And I have most of your cell phone numbers, so I may be calling to see if there's a large crowd behind you as you're hanging out somewhere. So get a good night's sleep. We have it's going to be a little different from what we normally do tomorrow, but we're on recess now until 9 o'clock. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.